God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. This is not a celebration. It is not the sneering atheism of those who think they have outgrown superstition. It is a diagnosis of catastrophe, perhaps the deepest catastrophe in the history of Western civilization. When Friedrich Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God in The Gay Science, he placed the words in the mouth of a madman who runs through the marketplace in broad daylight, carrying a lantern, crying that he seeks God. The people in the marketplace, themselves unbelievers, laugh at him. Has God gotten lost? They ask mockingly. Has he emigrated? But then the madman turns on them with a terrible truth. They have killed God, all of them together, and they do not yet understand what they have done. How did we drink up the sea? The madman asks. Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Are we not falling, backward, sideways, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? The death of God is not liberation but vertigo. It is the discovery that we have killed the foundation of everything we believed, everything we valued, everything that gave structure and meaning to human existence. For 2,000 years, Western civilization rested on a particular foundation. There was a God who created the world with purpose. There was a moral order written into the fabric of reality. There was a distinction between good and evil that held regardless of human opinion. There was redemption for suffering, meaning for pain, hope beyond death. This God guaranteed truth, grounded morality, and promised salvation. He was not merely a being among other beings, but the ultimate foundation, the source and guarantee of meaning itself. And now that foundation has collapsed. Nietzsche saw that the honest modern person could no longer believe in this God. The sciences had made a world designed by divine intention seem implausible. Biblical criticism had revealed scripture as human document rather than divine dictation. Historical consciousness had shown that moralities change across time and culture, that what one age calls sacred, another calls barbaric. The Enlightenment commitment to reason and evidence had undercut the authority of revelation and tradition. Europe had killed its God through the very virtues it had learned from Christianity: the commitment to truth, the refusal of comforting lies, the intellectual honesty that would not turn away from uncomfortable facts. Christianity, Nietzsche would later say, was destroyed by Christian truthfulness itself. But the death of God means far more than the decline of church attendance or the spread of secular attitudes. It means that everything built on that foundation begins to collapse. If there is no God, what is truth? If there is no God, what is good and evil? If there is no God, why should I care about others? If there is no God, why should I go on living? If there is no God, does anything matter at all? These are not academic questions. They are the questions that Nietzsche believed would define the 20th century and beyond. He called it nihilism, the devaluation of the highest values, the conviction that nothing has meaning, that existence is pointless, that it would have been better never to have been born. Nietzsche understood that most people had not yet grasped what the death of God entailed. They continued living as if the old values still held, as if morality still had its old foundation, as if life still had its old meaning. They were like the people in the marketplace who laugh at the madman because they have not understood their own deed. "I have come too early," the madman says. "This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time even after they are done, before they can be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. The question that consumed Nietzsche was, what comes after? Can humanity create new values now that the old values have lost their foundation? Can we affirm life without the promise of heaven, find meaning without a cosmic purpose, distinguish noble from base without a god to guarantee the distinction? Or will we sink into what Nietzsche called passive nihilism, the comfortable meaninglessness of those who no longer believe in anything beyond health and pleasure, and call it happiness? Will we become what he named the last man, the one who blinks, the one who has made everything small, the one who wants nothing but comfort and security and thinks himself wise for wanting so little? Nietzsche believed that some, a rare few, might be strong enough to face the abyss and not despair. These would be the ones who could create values rather than merely receive them, who could say yes to life despite its suffering, who could give meaning to existence without requiring it to be given from beyond. He called them Übermenschen, a word often mistranslated as supermen, but better understood as those who overcome the merely human, who surpass the need for otherworldly consolation. They would be the meaning of the earth, the ones who remain faithful to the earth, who do not believe in heavenly hopes but create earthly values. They would love their fate, Amor Fati, wanting nothing to be different, affirming even the most terrible aspects of existence as necessary parts of the whole. This was Nietzsche's response to the crisis he diagnosed. The death of God opens an abyss, but beyond the abyss lies a possibility, the possibility of freedom, of creativity, of life affirmation without resentment or escapism. The human being is something that must be overcome, Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. What have you done to overcome it? We are a rope stretched between animal and Übermensch, a dangerous crossing, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous trembling and stopping. Our greatness lies in being a transition and a going under, not a goal. The stakes could not be higher. Nietzsche was not offering comfortable wisdom or easy answers. He was diagnosing the deepest crisis in Western history and asking whether humanity had the strength to survive it. Would we create new values or sink into nihilism? Would we affirm life or seek escape? Would we face the truth that existence has no inherent meaning, or would we invent new lies to comfort ourselves? The 20th century, he believed, would be an age of catastrophe, an age when the foundations crumble and humanity must either find a new footing or fall. He was right about the catastrophe. Whether we have found the new footing remains an open question. Friedrich Nietzsche matters because we still live in the world he diagnosed. The death of God was not an event that happened in the 19th century and then passed. It is happening now. It is the world we inhabit, where traditional sources of meaning and authority have lost their power to command belief, where we struggle to find foundations for our values, where we oscillate between dogmatic certainties and bottomless relativism. Nietzsche saw this coming. He tried to think through what it means and what might come after. That makes him not a historical curiosity, but one of the philosophers we most need to understand. His question, how to live without ultimate foundations, how to create meaning in a meaningless universe, how to say yes to life despite everything, is still our question. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15th, 1844, in the village of Röcken in Prussian Saxony. He was born into the world he would later proclaim dead, the world of Christian piety, pastoral duty, and unquestioning faith. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor. His mother, Franziska Erler Nietzsche, was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor. His paternal grandfather had been a Lutheran pastor. His maternal grandfather held the same position. The household was saturated in Protestant devotion, in the certainty that God watched over all things, that Scripture contained truth, that salvation came through faith in Christ. The infant Friedrich was named after the reigning Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who happened to be born on the same day in the same month, October 15th. The family saw this coincidence as significant, a mark of favour. They believed they inhabited a world where such things were signs, where providence guided even small details. Karl Ludwig was a gifted preacher, known for his eloquence and his musical ability. He played the piano and taught his son to love music from the earliest age. The Nietzsche household rang with hymns and sacred compositions, with the sounds of devotion and the certainty of grace. Then came the catastrophe that would shadow all of Nietzsche's life and thought. In September 1848, when Friedrich was not yet 4 years old, Karl Ludwig began to suffer from terrible headaches and spells of what witnesses described as mental disturbance. The exact nature of his illness remains uncertain, perhaps a brain tumour, perhaps some other organic disease. But the decline was swift and devastating. By July 1849, Karl Ludwig was dead. He was 35 years old. His son Friedrich was 4. The little boy watched his father, the centre of his world, the voice of God's word, sicken and die. Worse followed. Friedrich's younger brother Joseph, born in 1848, died in January 1850, not yet 2 years old. In the space of less than a year, the family lost both the father and the younger son. Friedrich's world shrank to a household of women: his mother Franziska, his younger sister Elizabeth, born in 1846, his father's mother Erdmutter, and his father's 2 unmarried sisters, Augusta and Rosalie. They moved from the parsonage to the nearby town of Naumburg, where they lived in straitened circumstances, dependent on family support and the charity of the church. The loss of his father became the primal fact of Nietzsche's inner life. In a world supposedly governed by a loving God, the little boy's father, a faithful servant of that God, had been struck down seemingly without reason. The household remained pious, but for the sensitive child Friedrich, something had broken. He would later write that he experienced his father's death not as loss, but as amputation, a wounding that never healed. He dreamed repeatedly throughout his life of his father returning or of himself descending into the grave. Yet the surface remained calm. Friedrich became known as the Little Pastor. He was serious, dutiful, intensely religious. He read the Bible with attention. He composed hymns and prayers. His schoolmates remembered him as withdrawn and serious beyond his years, a boy who did not play rough games but preferred solitary reading and careful thought. He seemed to be taking on his father's role, trying to become what his father had been. There are photographs from his youth, a solemn boy with large eyes looking older than his age, already marked by the gravity that loss brings. Franziska was a devoted mother, but not an intellectual companion. She was pious in a conventional way, untroubled by doubt, certain of salvation. She loved her son, but did not understand him. Elizabeth, 2 years younger than Friedrich, would become his lifelong companion, correspondent, and eventual betrayer. Even in childhood, the pattern was set. Elizabeth worshipped her brother, imitated him, sought his approval, but never grasped the substance of his thought. She loved the image of the brilliant brother more than she loved or understood the actual person. The household in Naumburg was claustrophobic, provincial, narrow, 5 women and 1 boy living in genteel poverty, maintaining appearances, speaking in whispers about money. Franziska clung to respectability, to proper behaviour, to the memory of her husband's status. The aunts were stern, pious, censorious. The grandmother was the matriarch, ruling the household with traditional values and expectations. For Friedrich, it was a world of stifling propriety, of unexamined faith, of lives lived according to rules that were never questioned because they came from God. He was brilliant in school, a fact everyone recognized. His teachers at the local gymnasium saw immediately that this was no ordinary student. He mastered Latin and Greek with ease. He read widely, hungrily. He began to write poetry and short plays. He formed intense friendships with two classmates, Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, boys who shared his seriousness and his cultural ambitions. Together they formed a little artistic society, Germania, dedicated to sharing their literary and musical efforts. They wrote to each other in elevated language about art and beauty and the life of the mind. But already there were signs of something darker. The headaches began early, the terrible migraines that would plague Nietzsche all his life, the digestive troubles that would make eating an ordeal, the eye problems that would threaten his ability to read. Whether these were psychosomatic manifestations of inner distress or early signs of the organic disease that would eventually destroy him, we cannot know. But the pattern was set. A brilliant mind in a failing body, a soul that sought the heights in a frame that pulled toward collapse. In 1858, at age 13, Nietzsche won a scholarship to Schulpforta, one of the most prestigious classical boarding schools in Germany. It was recognition of his exceptional abilities, a chance to receive the finest education available. But it also meant leaving home, leaving his mother and sister, entering a rigorous and demanding environment. Schulpforta would shape him profoundly. It would give him the philological tools he would use all his life. It would drill into him the discipline of close reading, careful argumentation, attention to textual detail. It would immerse him in the ancient world, in Homer and Plato and the Greek tragedians, in Virgil and Cicero and the Roman historians. He was being trained to become a classical scholar, a teacher of ancient languages and literatures, a guardian of high culture. The boy who arrived at Schulpforta was still the little pastor, still devout, still convinced that God governed all things. But he was also beginning to ask questions. Why had his father died? Why did the good suffer? Why did God allow such things? These were not yet rebellious questions, not yet doubts about God's existence. They were the questions of a serious believer trying to understand divine providence. But they were the beginning. The death of the father had opened a wound. Now education would begin to open another. The recognition that the world described in Scripture did not match the world described in history and science and secular learning. Nietzsche would spend 6 years at Schulpforta from 1858 to 1864, years of intensive study and growing intellectual power. But those years would also bring the first serious cracks in his faith, the first glimmers of the philosophy that would emerge later. The boy who entered Schulpforta believed in God. The young man who left had begun to doubt. The shadow of the father, the loss of the father, the need to understand what the father's death meant, these would drive everything that followed. Nietzsche's philosophy begins in Röcken, in a little boy's experience of loss, in the collapse of the world that was supposed to protect him. Schulpforta was an institution designed to produce scholars, civil servants, and clergymen for the Prussian state. Founded in 1543 in a former Cistercian monastery, it had for 3 centuries educated the sons of German families in the classical languages and literatures. The routine was severe: rising before dawn, mandatory chapel services, long hours of study, rigorous examinations. Students learned to read Greek and Latin texts with scholarly precision, to write elegant prose in classical style, to appreciate the monuments of ancient culture. It was a training in philology, the disciplined study of texts and languages, and Nietzsche excelled at it beyond all his peers. His teachers quickly recognized his exceptional gifts. In Greek, he moved beyond the standard texts to read Theonis and Aeschylus with scholarly apparatus. In Latin, he composed original poems in classical meters. He wrote essays on literary and philosophical topics that showed remarkable maturity. He began to keep notebooks in which he recorded his thoughts on what he read, his questions about meaning and value, his attempts to understand the ancient world. These early notebooks reveal a mind hungry for understanding, eager to grasp the whole, impatient with superficiality. But Schulpforta also brought strain. The discipline was harsh, the expectations relentless. Nietzsche suffered from migraines that would sometimes confine him to his bed for days. His eyesight troubled him, making reading painful. He experienced bouts of nausea and digestive distress. The body was already rebelling, already signaling that something was wrong. Yet he drove himself harder, refusing to let physical weakness interfere with intellectual ambition. He would maintain this pattern all his life, the will pushing the body beyond its limits, the mind refusing to acknowledge the fragility of its vehicle. During these years, his religious faith began to erode. The process was gradual, barely visible at first. He wrote a school essay on divine providence that asked uncomfortable questions about why God allows evil. He began to notice contradictions in scripture, problems in the biblical narrative. He read David Strauss's Life of Jesus, a work of historical criticism that treated the Gospels as human documents rather than divine revelation. He encountered the new biblical scholarship that was dismantling traditional faith through historical analysis. The God of his childhood, the God who had taken his father, began to seem less certain, less real. Yet the decisive event came not at Schulpforta, but during his first year at university. In October 1864, Nietzsche left Schulpforta with highest honours and entered the University of Bonn. He enrolled in theology and philology, still following the expected path toward a career as a Lutheran pastor like his father. He joined a student fraternity, Franconia, and participated in its rituals and celebrations. He drank, sang, even fought a duel that left him with a small scar on his nose. He was trying, perhaps, to be a normal student, to enter the social world of his peers. But he was profoundly unhappy. The theology lectures seemed empty to him, the professors dull, the faith they expounded increasingly implausible. After one semester, he dropped theology entirely, to his mother's horror and grief. He would study only philology now, only the secular discipline of textual study. It was a declaration. He would not become a pastor, would not follow his father's path, would not serve a God he no longer believed in. Franziska wrote desperate letters pleading with him to reconsider. The aunts expressed shock and disappointment. But Nietzsche was certain. The faith was gone, and he would not pretend otherwise for the sake of family peace or social expectation. After a year at Bonn, he followed his favourite professor, Friedrich Wilhelm Ritschl, to the University of Leipzig. Ritschl was a distinguished classical philologist, a master of textual criticism, a scholar of the first rank. Under his guidance, Nietzsche began serious research in ancient texts. He worked on problems in the manuscript tradition of Theonis and the authenticity of certain Aristotelian works. He published his first scholarly article at age 21. He was being groomed for an academic career, for a professorship at a German university, for a life of teaching and scholarship. Then, in October 1865, something happened that would change everything. Nietzsche was browsing in a second-hand bookshop in Leipzig when he came across a book he had never heard of, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He picked it up, began to read, and could not stop. He bought it immediately, took it home, and read through the night and into the next day. Later he would describe this encounter as a conversion experience, the most important intellectual event of his life to that point. Schopenhauer offered a philosophy radically different from anything Nietzsche had encountered in his academic studies. The world, Schopenhauer argued, was not rational, not purposeful, not designed by a benevolent creator. It was the manifestation of a blind will, a ceaseless striving without goal or meaning. Existence was suffering because the will could never be satisfied, always wanting, always grasping, always frustrated. Human life was caught in this endless cycle of desire and disappointment. The only escape was through the denial of the will itself, through asceticism, through the negation of desire, ultimately through a kind of mystical self-annihilation. This was a philosophy of profound pessimism, a vision of existence as fundamentally tragic. But for Nietzsche, it was also liberation. Here was a thinker who did not pretend that the world was good, who did not offer comforting lies, who faced the darkness honestly. Schopenhauer looked at suffering and did not explain it away with theodicies. He looked at death and did not promise resurrection. He looked at meaninglessness and did not invent cosmic purposes. He was, Nietzsche thought, a philosopher of honesty, a thinker willing to face truths that others fled. Moreover, Schopenhauer offered a philosophy grounded in experience rather than abstract concepts. He wrote about art and music and aesthetic experience with a depth that moved Nietzsche profoundly. Music, Schopenhauer argued, was the direct manifestation of the will itself, bypassing concepts and representations to touch the metaphysical core of existence. This resonated deeply with Nietzsche's own love of music, his sense that in music one encountered something more fundamental than words or ideas could express. For the next several years, Nietzsche was an enthusiastic Schopenhauerian. He evangelized for the philosophy among his friends. He defended Schopenhauer against critics. He tried to live according to Schopenhauer's recommendations for denying the will. The notebooks from this period are filled with reflections on pessimism, on suffering, on the possibility of salvation through aesthetic contemplation. Schopenhauer gave him a framework for understanding the loss of his father, the pain of existence, the absence of God. If the world was suffering and the will was the source of suffering, then perhaps the answer was to quiet the will, to seek the peace of resignation and renunciation. But even in his enthusiastic adoption of Schopenhauerian pessimism, there were signs of resistance. Nietzsche was too life-affirming, too eager for experience, too ambitious to truly embrace resignation. He read Schopenhauer as philosophy, as truth about the world, but he did not live as Schopenhauer recommended. He continued his scholarly work with undiminished energy. He pursued friendships and intellectual exchanges. He sought out new experiences and new ideas. The tension was already present between the philosophy that said life was suffering and should be denied, and the temperament that said life was glorious and should be seized. This tension would define everything that followed. Nietzsche's entire mature philosophy can be understood as a prolonged argument with Schopenhauer, an attempt to preserve the honesty and depth while rejecting the pessimism and resignation. He would keep Schopenhauer's refusal to comfort or console, his willingness to face the tragic aspects of existence. But he would reverse the verdict, not denial of life, but affirmation of life, not resignation before suffering, but joy despite suffering, not the quieting of the will, but the intensification of the will. The Schopenhauerian moment was essential, but it was also the starting point for a philosophy that would move in the opposite direction. In November 1868, in Leipzig, Friedrich Nietzsche met Richard Wagner. Nietzsche was 24 years old, a brilliant young scholar on the verge of academic appointment. Wagner was 55, already the most famous and controversial composer in Europe, creator of revolutionary music dramas that critics either hailed as the future of art or denounced as barbaric noise. They met at the home of Wagner's brother-in-law, the Leipzig professor Hermann Brockhaus, and the encounter changed Nietzsche's life. Wagner dominated every room he entered. He was volcanic, charismatic, overwhelming. He talked endlessly about his theories of art and culture, about the degeneration of modern civilization, about the need for aesthetic renewal. He was a Schopenhauerian like Nietzsche, convinced that music expressed the deepest truths of existence. He was building a temple to his art at Bayreuth, where he would stage his ring cycle away from the commercial theatres. He needed disciples, admirers, apostles to spread his gospel. And in young Nietzsche, he found one. For Nietzsche, Wagner was everything he had lost: a father figure, older, accomplished, certain of his genius, a philosophical companion. They spoke the same Schopenhauerian language, shared the same pessimism, valued the same things. An artistic prophet. Wagner's music moved Nietzsche as nothing else did, seemed to embody the Dionysian truths he was beginning to glimpse. Within weeks of their first meeting, Nietzsche was visiting Wagner regularly, sitting in the Wagner household for hours, listening to the master read from his latest works, play fragments of compositions in progress, expound his theories of culture and history. Wagner and his wife Cosima welcomed the young scholar into their circle. They recognized his brilliance and his devotion. They treated him almost as a family member, inviting him to their estate at Tribschen on Lake Lucerne, including him in their intimate gatherings, consulting him on matters of scholarship. For Nietzsche, it was intoxicating. He had found a home, a purpose, a cause larger than academic philology. He would be Wagner's advocate, the philosopher who explained Wagner's significance, the scholar who provided intellectual respectability for the Wagnerian Revolution. In February 1869, before Nietzsche had even completed his doctorate, he received an extraordinary offer, a full professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was 24 years old. Such early appointments were almost unheard of, but Ritschl had recommended him in the strongest possible terms, calling him a miracle of talent. The university waived the requirement for a completed dissertation and granted him the doctorate based on his published articles. The University of Leipzig followed suit, conferring the doctorate without examination. In May 1869, Nietzsche moved to Basel to take up his position. Basel brought him closer to Tribschen, where Wagner and Cosima had settled. Nietzsche visited every few weeks whenever his teaching schedule allowed. He brought gifts, books Wagner wanted, information about scholarly debates. He played piano duets with Cosima. He listened to Wagner work through musical ideas. He celebrated Wagner's birthday with elaborate dedications. On Christmas 1870, he arrived at Tribschen to find Cosima's birthday surprise for Wagner, the first performance of the Siegfried Idyll, a chamber work Wagner had composed for her, performed on the stairs of their villa by a small orchestra gathered secretly for the occasion. Nietzsche wept at the beauty of it. Wagner represented what Nietzsche called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork. In Wagner's music dramas, poetry, music, drama, and visual spectacle combined into a unified whole. This was art as religion, art as redemption, art as the highest meaning human life could attain. In a world where God was dead and traditional religion had lost its power, perhaps art could become the new source of value, the new path to truth. Perhaps the aesthetic experience could replace the religious experience. Perhaps Wagner was the prophet of this new dispensation. But even at the height of his devotion, Nietzsche felt something was wrong. Wagner's anti-Semitism was overt and ugly, expressed in essays and in private conversation with a venom that disturbed Nietzsche. Wagner's nationalism, his insistence on German greatness and German destiny, struck Nietzsche as provincial and dangerous. Wagner's increasing religiosity, His turn toward Christian themes and Christian redemption contradicted the Schopenhauerian atheism they supposedly shared. Wagner was becoming everything Nietzsche mistrusted: nationalist, anti-Semitic, Christian, crowd-pleasing. Moreover, there was something unhealthy in the relationship itself. Nietzsche was not Wagner's colleague, but his acolyte. Wagner did not discuss, he proclaimed. He did not ask for Nietzsche's views, he expected agreement and admiration. Cosima, brilliant and steely, encouraged this dynamic. She saw Nietzsche's role clearly: to serve Wagner's glory, to spread Wagner's reputation, to subordinate his own development to the master's needs. When Nietzsche hesitated or showed independence, she could be cutting and cold. The break was inevitable, but it took years to complete. The first clear sign came in 1876, when Wagner staged the first complete ring cycle at the newly completed Bayreuth Festival Theatre. Nietzsche attended the rehearsals and performances, but instead of triumph, he felt revulsion. The event had become a social circus, attended by the Kaiser and various European nobility, covered by journalists from around the world. It was spectacle and self-promotion, not sacred art. Wagner basked in the attention, played to the crowds, courted the powerful. Nietzsche left Bayreuth early, pleading illness, but actually fleeing what he now saw as vulgar and empty. The final blow came with Parsifal, Wagner's last music drama. It told the story of Christian redemption through the Holy Grail, of purity recovered through renunciation and faith. When Nietzsche learned what Wagner was composing, he was horrified. This was not Schopenhauerian pessimism, but Christian sentimentality. This was not tragic acceptance, but escapist longing for salvation. Wagner, the revolutionary, the atheist, the Schopenhauerian, had become a propagandist for the very religion Nietzsche believed had poisoned Western culture. It was betrayal, hypocrisy, weakness. In 1878, Nietzsche sent Wagner a copy of his new book, Human All Too Human. It was a book of aphorisms that attacked everything Wagner stood for: metaphysics, romanticism, the redemptive power of art. It praised science, skepticism, rational analysis. It was a declaration of independence, a breaking of chains. Wagner never responded. Cosima wrote a brief, cold note. The silence that followed was absolute. The surrogate father had been repudiated, and the surrogate father repudiated in return. The wound never healed. For the rest of his productive life, Nietzsche would return obsessively to Wagner in his writings, alternating between admiration for the early revolutionary Wagner and contempt for the later Christian Wagner. He would diagnose Wagner as a symptom of cultural decadence, a seducer rather than a liberator, a source of poison rather than health. But the bitterness in these denunciations reveals how deep the loss went. Nietzsche had loved Wagner and needed Wagner and been betrayed by Wagner. The relationship with the father had ended in death. The relationship with the surrogate father ended in mutual rejection. The pattern of loss deepened. In January 1872, Nietzsche published his first book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. He was 27 years old, a junior professor of philology, and he produced a work that outraged his fellow philologists and established him as a philosophical voice. It was supposed to be a scholarly work on the origins of Greek tragedy, but it turned into something much stranger: a speculative philosophy of art, a critique of rationalism, and a manifesto for Wagner's music dramas. It was brilliant, reckless, and catastrophic for Nietzsche's academic reputation. The book's central claim was that Greek tragedy emerged from the fusion of two fundamental aesthetic principles, which Nietzsche named the Dionysian and the Apollinian after the Greek gods Dionysus and Apollo. The Dionysian represented intoxication, dissolution, the loss of individuality, the ecstatic return to primal unity. The Apollinian represented form, measure, beautiful appearance, the principium individuationis that separates one thing from another. Greek tragedy at its height in Aeschylus and Sophocles achieved a miraculous synthesis. Apollinian form containing and expressing Dionysian chaos, tragic heroes maintaining their individuality while acknowledging their ultimate dissolution into the universal suffering. The Dionysian was connected to music, to the chorus of satyrs, to the collective dithyramb that dissolved individual identity into group frenzy. In the state of Dionysian intoxication, the barriers between self and other collapse. One experiences what Schopenhauer called the will itself, the blind striving, the endless suffering, the primal unity beneath all appearances. This is terrifying, overwhelming, but also liberating. The individual discovers that his separateness is illusion, that he is connected to all existence through shared suffering and shared ecstasy. The Apollinian was connected to dream, to sculpture, to visual beauty. Apollo was the god of light, form, measure, rationality. Under Apollo's influence, the terror of existence becomes bearable through beautiful semblance. The individual is celebrated rather than dissolved. The hero stands forth in his particularity, his nobility, his tragic fate. The horror is not denied but transformed into aesthetic spectacle, contemplated from a distance that makes it endurable. Greek tragedy achieved something unprecedented. It combined these opposites. The tragic hero, an Apollinian creation, stood before the Dionysian chorus. The individual confronted the universal. Form contained chaos. The audience experienced both the hero's particular suffering and the chorus's collective wisdom. They participated in the Dionysian dissolution through the music while maintaining Apollinian distance through the dramatic structure. The effect was cathartic, redemptive, life-affirming despite the tragic content. The Greeks looked into the abyss and through their art made the abyss bearable. But then, Nietzsche argued, tragedy died. It died because of Socrates and Euripides, who represented the rise of rationalism, the faith that everything could be understood through logic and reason. Socrates appeared in Athens proclaiming that virtue is knowledge, that wisdom consists in logical demonstration, that the unexamined life is not worth living. This rationalism killed tragedy because tragedy depends on acknowledging that life contains elements reason cannot master, that suffering may have no explanation, that wisdom sometimes means accepting mystery rather than demanding clarity. Euripides, influenced by Socratic rationalism, began writing tragedies that explained everything, that made every character rational and articulate, that replaced mythic necessity with psychological motivation. The chorus diminished. The Dionysian element withered. What remained was clever dialogue, rhetorical display, theatrical effect without metaphysical depth. The synthesis collapsed. Greek tragedy became mere entertainment rather than sacred art. The Socratic optimism, the faith that knowledge brings happiness and that reason can solve all problems, spread throughout Western culture. It became the foundation of philosophy and science, the assumption that understanding equals mastery. But Nietzsche saw this optimism as shallow and ultimately tragic itself. It denied the Dionysian truth, that existence at its core is suffering, striving, chaos. It substituted comfortable illusions for terrible truths. It made life bearable by making it small, by pretending that reason could control what reason cannot even comprehend. Modern culture, Nietzsche argued, was exhausted by this rationalism. It had lost the capacity for tragic art, for Dionysian wisdom, for saying yes to life despite its horror. But perhaps, Nietzsche suggested hopefully, a rebirth was possible. Perhaps in Wagner's music dramas, the synthesis of Apollinian and Dionysian could be recovered. Perhaps the Ring cycle, with its mythic narratives and overwhelming music, could restore what Greek tragedy had once provided, an art form that faced existence honestly and made it bearable through aesthetic transfiguration. This suggestion, this obvious advocacy for Wagner, made the book scandalous in academic circles. Philologists were supposed to produce careful scholarly analyses of texts, not speculative aesthetic theories mixed with propaganda for contemporary composers. Nietzsche's former teacher Ritschl was dismayed. His colleague Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Mühlendorf, another brilliant young philologist, published a savage review attacking the book's methodology, its evidence, its entire approach. The birth of tragedy was not scholarship but irresponsible fantasy, Wilamowitz charged. It should be ignored by serious scholars. And it was. The book sold poorly. Academics shunned it. Nietzsche's career as a philologist effectively ended with its publication. His classes at Basel attracted fewer students each year as his reputation as an unreliable scholar spread. He would publish 3 more volumes of essays, The Untimely Meditations, between 1873 and 1876, but these too were more cultural criticism than scholarship. He was becoming something new, not a philologist but a philosopher, not an interpreter of ancient texts, but a diagnostician of modern culture. Yet the concepts introduced in The Birth of Tragedy would remain central to all of Nietzsche's later work. The Dionysian and Apollinian, the critique of Socratic rationalism, the possibility of saying yes to life despite suffering, these would be developed and transformed, but never abandoned. The book was the birth not only of a theory of tragedy, but of Nietzsche's philosophy itself. It announced themes he would spend the rest of his life exploring. How do we face existence honestly without despair? How do we create meaning in a world without inherent purpose? How do we say yes to a life that includes inevitable suffering and death? The book also revealed something about Nietzsche's method and temperament. He was not interested in academic caution or conventional scholarly standards. He wanted truth that mattered, philosophy that changed how one lived, ideas that struck like lightning rather than accumulated like footnotes. He was willing to risk his reputation, his career, his social standing for the sake of ideas he believed were important. This recklessness, this intensity, this refusal to play it safe would characterize everything he wrote. It would make him both more important and more dangerous than his careful academic colleagues could ever be. The years following The Birth of Tragedy brought increasing physical suffering and growing disillusionment. Nietzsche's health, never robust, deteriorated steadily. The migraines became more frequent and severe, sometimes lasting several days, accompanied by vomiting and temporary blindness. His eyesight worsened to the point where reading for more than brief periods became agonizing. His digestion troubled him constantly. He tried various treatments, consulted different physicians, experimented with diets and medications, but nothing provided lasting relief. He began to spend his university vacations in Italian Switzerland and on the Italian Riviera, seeking climates that might ease his suffering. At the same time, his relationship with Wagner grew more complicated and strained. After the initial intoxication of discipleship, Nietzsche began to see what he had been reluctant to acknowledge. Wagner was not the revolutionary artist Nietzsche needed him to be. Wagner's politics were reactionary, his cultural views narrow and nationalistic. His anti-Semitism was not merely casual prejudice, but systematic ideology. His treatment of others was manipulative and self-serving. He used people for his purposes and discarded them when they were no longer useful. He demanded absolute loyalty and could not tolerate disagreement or independence. The Bayreuth Festival of 1876 crystallized Nietzsche's disenchantment. The festival was supposed to be the realization of Wagner's artistic vision, the temple where great art would be celebrated away from commercial corruption. But what Nietzsche witnessed was spectacle and social climbing, journalists and nobility, nationalism and self-congratulation. The music itself, which he had once found overwhelming, now struck him as manipulative and calculated to produce effects rather than express truth. Wagner was playing to the crowd, seeking mass appeal, becoming what he had once despised, an entertainer rather than a prophet. Nietzsche left Bayreuth before the festival ended, claiming illness. He wandered alone in the Bavarian forest, wrestling with what he had seen and felt. The crisis was not merely aesthetic but existential. If Wagner was not the answer, if even the greatest modern art was compromised and corrupt, what could redeem modern culture? If music could not save us, if the aesthetic experience could not replace religious meaning, where should one turn? Nietzsche had lost his father at 4. He had lost his faith in God in his early 20s. Now he was losing his faith in art and the artist who represented it. He tried to maintain the relationship, tried to convince himself that he had been hasty or unfair, but in 1877 he learned that Wagner was working on Parsifal, a music drama based on the medieval legend of the Holy Grail. When Nietzsche finally saw the text, his worst fears were confirmed. Parsifal was a Christian redemption drama celebrating purity, renunciation, and faith. The hero achieves salvation by resisting sexual temptation and embracing compassionate service. The work concluded with the elevation of the host, with explicit Christian liturgy, with the promise of redemption through grace. This was betrayal. Wagner, the supposed Schopenhauerian who had taught Nietzsche that Christianity was life-denying weakness, had written a love letter to Christianity. Wagner, the revolutionary who had fought in the 1849 Dresden uprising, had become a court composer seeking favour with kings and emperors. Wagner, who had proclaimed that art must face truth without comforting illusions, had created a fantasy of otherworldly salvation. Everything Nietzsche believed Wagner represented had been revealed as pose or delusion. In 1878, Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human, a book of aphorisms that systematically demolished everything Wagner stood for. It attacked metaphysics as wish fulfillment. It criticized romanticism as emotional self-indulgence. It questioned whether art could bear the weight of providing life's meaning. It praised science, reason, skepticism, intellectual honesty. It was written in a style completely different from the birth of tragedy. Cool, analytical, fragmentary, anti-systematic. Where the birth of tragedy had been passionate and visionary, Human, All Too Human was deliberately deflating and diagnostic. Nietzsche sent a copy to Wagner. Wagner never replied. Cosima sent a brief, icy note expressing disappointment that Nietzsche had abandoned the Wagnerian cause. Other members of the Wagner circle were more openly hostile. Some accused Nietzsche of ingratitude, of betraying the man who had befriended him. Others suggested he was jealous, unable to create art himself, and therefore attacking those who could. Hans von Bülow, the conductor and Wagner partisan, said that Nietzsche should have been whipped for writing such a book. The silence from Tribschen was absolute and final. Wagner and Nietzsche would never speak again. When Wagner died in Venice in February 1883, Nietzsche was in Genoa, working on the third part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He learned of the death from a newspaper and collapsed in uncontrollable weeping. Despite everything, despite the break and the bitterness, Wagner remained the greatest loss of his life after his father. The man who had been surrogate father, philosophical companion, and aesthetic inspiration was gone, and the wound of their separation would never be healed by reconciliation. In his later works, Nietzsche would return obsessively to Wagner. He would write a short book, The The Case of Wagner in 1888, analysing Wagner as a symptom of cultural decadence. He would add an appendix to later editions of The Birth of Tragedy, distancing himself from the youthful enthusiasm of the original. He would diagnose Wagner as an actor, a master of theatrical effects, a creator of illusions rather than a prophet of truth. He would argue that Wagner's music was physiologically unhealthy, that it made listeners passive rather than active, that it sedated rather than stimulated. But the intensity of these denunciations revealed how much Wagner still mattered, how deeply the relationship had marked him. Nietzsche had needed Wagner to be someone Wagner could not be: honest, revolutionary, life-affirming, immune to the seductions of success and popularity. When Wagner revealed himself as mortal, flawed, self-serving, Nietzsche felt the betrayal as deeply as he had felt his father's death. Both men had been supposed to provide certainty, foundation, direction. Both had failed him, though in very different ways. The break with Wagner forced Nietzsche to think for himself, to develop his own philosophy without the crutch of artistic genius to admire and interpret. It was liberation and devastation together. From 1878 forward, Nietzsche would be truly alone, without father or surrogate father, without faith or aesthetic substitute for faith, without community or institutional support. He would have only his own thinking, his own experience, his own struggle to find meaning without foundations. This loneliness would be the condition for his greatest work, but it would also be the source of unending suffering. In 1879, Nietzsche's health collapsed completely. The migraines and eye problems that had troubled him for years became unbearable. He could barely teach his classes. Reading was agony. He spent weeks at a time confined to dark rooms, unable to endure light. The university granted him sick leave, and when it became clear he could not continue, he resigned his professorship in May 1879. He was 34 years old, his academic career over, his future uncertain. The university granted him a modest pension, enough to live on frugally but not comfortably. He was now what he would remain for the rest of his productive life, a wanderer, moving from boarding house to boarding house, seeking climates that might ease his suffering. Yet this catastrophe was also liberation. Free from teaching duties and academic constraints, free from the expectations of professional respectability, he could write what he truly thought without worrying about career consequences. The books that flowed from these years of wandering would establish his reputation and define his philosophy. Cut loose from all moorings, family, profession, community, nation, he would develop the philosophy of the free spirit, the individual who thinks without the comfort of traditional certainties. Human, All Too Human, published in 1878 with 2 later supplements, marked the beginning of this new phase. The book was revolutionary in both content and style. In content, it systematically questioned every comforting belief, every traditional value, every metaphysical claim. In style, it abandoned the sustained argument and visionary prose of The Birth of Tragedy for short-numbered aphorisms that could be read in any order, each one a self-contained insight or provocation. This aphoristic method would remain characteristic of Nietzsche's mature work, perfectly suited to a thinker who distrusted systems and valued multiple perspectives. The book's main theme was the critique of metaphysics and morality. Metaphysics, Nietzsche argued, rests on a series of false oppositions: body and soul, appearance and reality, temporal and eternal, changing and permanent. Metaphysicians assume these opposites are separate realms and that the second term in each pair is more real or valuable than the first. But what if these opposites are not fundamentally different? What if they are connected by gradual transitions? What if what we call spirit is just refined body? What we call soul is just complex physical process? What we call eternal is just what we imagine when we deny time. This questioning extended to morality. Morality claims to be about objective good and evil, about duties that hold regardless of consequences or circumstances. But Nietzsche suggested that morality is better understood as a system of evaluations that arose from particular historical conditions and serves particular interests. What we call moral behavior is often self-interest that has forgotten itself, behavior that once served survival or social cohesion, but now presents itself as absolute duty. The moral person is not more selfless than the immoral person. He has simply internalized a different set of interests. Nietzsche called this approach the historical philosophy as opposed to metaphysical philosophy. Instead of asking what things are eternally, ask how they came to be. Instead of seeking timeless truths, trace historical developments. Instead of accepting values as given, investigate their origins. This genealogical method, which Nietzsche would develop more fully in later works, dissolved the apparent naturalness of moral categories by showing that they had histories, that they arose in particular times and places, that they serve particular purposes. The book also attacked the redemptive role of art that Nietzsche had championed in The Birth of Tragedy. Art does not provide access to metaphysical truth. It provides beautiful illusions, pleasurable experiences, but not knowledge of reality. The artist is not a prophet, but a creator of appearances, and this is valuable precisely because it does not claim to be more than it is. Art enriches life by adding beauty, not by revealing hidden depths. Science, by contrast, receives surprising praise. Not science as dogmatic materialism, but science as a method of careful observation, hypothesis testing, and willingness to revise beliefs based on evidence. The scientific spirit is the spirit of intellectual honesty, the refusal to accept comforting beliefs just because they are comforting. This honesty is difficult and sometimes painful, but it is also liberating. Better harsh truths than beautiful lies, better uncertainty than false certainty. Better to face reality as it is than to console oneself with fantasies of how one wishes it to be. The free spirit who emerges from this process of disillusionment is not nihilistic but liberated. Having given up metaphysical consolations, supernatural hopes, and absolute moral certainties, the free spirit can appreciate what actually exists. This world, this life, these experiences. Having abandoned otherworldly longings, the free spirit can say yes to earthly existence. Having recognized that values are human creations rather than divine decrees, the free spirit can take responsibility for creating values. This is not yet the full-fledged philosophy of life affirmation that would emerge in Nietzsche's later works. Human, all too human, still bears traces of Schopenhauerian pessimism, still sometimes suggests that life might be better denied than affirmed. But the movement toward affirmation is already present. The critique of metaphysics and morality is not merely destructive but preparatory. It clears away illusions so that something new can be built, something truer to actual human experience. The aphoristic style reflects this philosophy of freedom. A systematic treatise implies that truth comes in one package, that ideas fit together into a complete whole, that the author has mastered his subject. But Nietzsche no longer believed in complete systems. He believed in partial perspectives, experimental thoughts, tentative hypotheses. The aphorism captures an insight without claiming to be the whole truth. It invites the reader to think along rather than merely accept. It leaves gaps for interpretation, contradictions to puzzle over, deliberately refuses closure. This style would alienate many readers who wanted clear answers and definite conclusions. It would also attract readers who found in Nietzsche's fragments the stimulus to think for themselves. The aphoristic method was not merely literary style, but philosophical principle. Truth comes in perspectives, not in totalizing systems. One grasps reality from many angles rather than from one comprehensive view. Philosophy should provoke thought rather than provide answers. During these years of wandering, Nietzsche followed a punishing routine. He would rise early, work on writing if his eyes permitted, take long solitary walks thinking through ideas, eat frugally in modest restaurants or have simple meals in his room, avoid social gatherings that might strain his health. He moved seasonally, winters in Genoa or Nice on the Mediterranean coast where the climate was mild, summers in the Swiss mountains at Sils Maria where the air was clear. He travelled with few possessions, some clothes, his manuscripts, writing materials, books he was currently working with. He lived in boarding houses and small hotels, always alone, always moving on when the season changed or his health demanded different conditions. The loneliness was profound. He had almost no close friends left. His family relationships were strained by his abandonment of Christianity and his rejection of German nationalism. His sister Elizabeth had married Bernhard Förster, a notorious anti-Semite, and moved to Paraguay to found a German colonial settlement. Nietzsche had opposed the marriage violently, seeing it as betrayal of everything he believed, but Elizabeth proceeded anyway. His mother remained in Germany, pious and conventional, unable to understand what her son had become. The letters between them grew increasingly distant, filled with dutiful pleasantries that concealed mutual incomprehension. Yet from this loneliness and suffering emerged some of the most important philosophy of the modern age. Nietzsche was learning what it meant to stand alone, to think without support systems, to create values without divine authority or traditional sanction. He was becoming, in his own life, the free spirit he wrote about, unhoused, unattached, thinking through everything from the ground up, accepting no authority but his own judgment and experience. The cost was enormous. The achievement would be unprecedented. The 1880s were Nietzsche's decade of homelessness and productivity. Having resigned from his Basel professorship in 1879, he spent the next 10 years moving between Italian cities, Swiss mountain villages, and French Mediterranean towns. He travelled light, a small trunk containing clothes and manuscripts, notebooks for writing, a few essential books. He lived in modest boarding houses, usually taking the cheapest rooms, eating simple meals, spending his days walking and thinking and writing. He had no permanent address, no community, no institutional affiliation. He was what he would later call a good European rather than a German nationalist, a wanderer rather than a rooted citizen, a free spirit rather than a herd animal. The routine was dictated by his health, which remained precarious throughout these years. The migraines, eyesight problems, and digestive troubles meant he had to carefully manage his days. He would wake early, often at 5 or 6 in the morning, and write if his eyes permitted. When they did not, he dictated to friends or hired secretaries, though this was always less satisfactory than writing himself. By mid-morning, the headaches would often force him to stop. He would walk for hours, always alone, thinking through ideas, composing sentences mentally. After lunch, more walking or rest. Evening was sometimes tolerable for more work, but often he simply had to endure the pain in darkness and silence. Despite these limitations, his productivity was astonishing. Between 1878 and 1888, he published a book almost every year, each one pushing his philosophy in new directions, developing ideas with greater clarity and force. After Human, All Too Human came Daybreak in 1881, The Gay Science in 1882. Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 4 parts between 1883 and 1885, Beyond Good and Evil in 1886, On the Genealogy of Morals in 1887, and the final burst of production in 1888, The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. The book sold poorly, sometimes fewer than 100 copies in a year, but Nietzsche persisted, convinced that he was writing for a future audience that would understand what his contemporaries could not grasp. The cities and towns he inhabited became associated with particular works and particular moods. Genoa in winter 1880 to 1881 brought daybreak, the first sustained attack on Christian morality. Nice in the early 1880s provided mild climate and anonymous streets where he could walk unrecognized. Sils Maria in the Swiss Engadine became his summer home, returning each year to the same boarding house, the same walks along the lake and through the surrounding mountains. It was in Sils Maria, in August 1881, that he had the experience of eternal recurrence, the thought that would become central to his mature philosophy. Venice and Turin he loved for their architecture and atmosphere, their distance from German heaviness and severity. Genoa deserves particular attention because it was there that Nietzsche began to overcome the pessimism inherited from Schopenhauer. Walking the city's narrow streets, looking out over the Mediterranean, he felt something shift. Life was not merely suffering to be endured or denied. It was also joy, beauty, possibility. Even suffering could be affirmed if it was part of a larger whole worth affirming. This was the beginning of his philosophy of affirmation, the yes saying that would culminate in the concept of Amor Fati, the love of fate. Daybreak, published in 1881, marked the transition. The book's full title was Daybreak, Thoughts on Moral Prejudices, and its theme was that morality itself might be a prejudice, something we accept because of tradition and training, rather than because of rational justification. Nietzsche examined the psychology behind moral claims, asking what needs and fears and resentments find expression in moral rules. He suggested that much of what passes for altruism is disguised self-interest, that much of what passes for duty is internalized social control, that much of what passes for virtue is the revenge of the weak against the strong. This was genealogy in embryo, the investigation of origins as a way of undermining claims to absolute validity. If we can show that a moral belief arose from particular historical circumstances, served particular interests, emerged from particular psychological needs, we have not refuted it, but we have shown that it is not eternal truth. It is human, all too human, a creation rather than a discovery. And if it is created, it can be evaluated, revised, or rejected. We are not bound by it unless we choose to be. The Gay Science, published in 1882 and expanded in 1887, brought this approach to full development. The title itself was significant. The Gaia Scienza of the medieval Provençal troubadour, joyful wisdom, the combination of light-heartedness and profundity. Nietzsche was learning to laugh, to be playful even about serious matters, to approach philosophy with lightness rather than Germanic heaviness. The book is written in aphorisms, poems, and parable-like passages, mixing styles and tones, refusing the solemnity that philosophy usually demands. Section 125 of The Gay Science contains the famous passage about the death of God, the madman in the marketplace. But equally important is section 341, which introduces the thought of eternal recurrence. Imagine, Nietzsche writes, that a demon came to you and said that you would have to live your life again exactly as it has been, an infinite number of times, with every pain and every joy repeating eternally. Would you curse the demon, or would you answer, "Never have I heard anything more divine"? The question is whether you love your life enough to will it again eternally. Whether you can say yes, not just to the pleasant moments, but to the whole, including the suffering. This thought became Nietzsche's existential touchstone. Eternal recurrence is not primarily a cosmological theory about whether time is cyclical, though Nietzsche sometimes considered it as such. It is primarily a test. Do you love your life enough to want it again exactly as it has been, forever? If not, you have reason to change it. If so, you have achieved Amor Fati, the love of fate, the supreme affirmation. The thought separates those who are life-affirming from those who are life-denying, those who say yes to existence from those who long for escape. During these years, Nietzsche had few personal relationships, but two deserve mention. Peter Gast, whose real name was Heinrich Koselitz, served as Nietzsche's amanuensis, copyist, and musical companion. Gast was a composer of modest talent and boundless admiration for Nietzsche. He helped prepare manuscripts for publication, copied pages when Nietzsche's eyesight failed, corresponded regularly, provided emotional support. Gast never questioned, never criticized, never challenged. He was disciple rather than friend, but Nietzsche needed at least one person who believed in his work without reservation. Franz Overbeck, a professor of theology at Basel, was closer to genuine friendship. Overbeck shared Nietzsche's skepticism about Christianity, his distance from German nationalism, his sense of intellectual isolation. They corresponded frequently, and Overbeck sometimes visited during Nietzsche's wanderings. When the final collapse came in January 1889, it would be Overbeck who travelled to Turin to bring Nietzsche back to safety. But even with Overbeck, the relationship was conducted mostly through letters, separated by distance and circumstance. The profound loneliness of these years cannot be overstated. Nietzsche saw almost no one, spoke to almost no one, lived in his thoughts and his writing with only brief excursions into social contact. He ate alone, walked alone, suffered alone. He had no partner, no intimate companion, no one with whom to share the daily texture of life. This isolation was partly circumstantial, produced by his health and his financial limitations, but it was also philosophical. The free spirit must stand alone, must think without the comfort of community consensus, must create values without collective support. The question, which Nietzsche would address directly in his later works, was whether this isolation was necessary for independence or whether it was destroying him. Could one be a free spirit and also have human connection, love, community? Or did genuine independence require absolute solitude? The evidence of his life suggests the latter, but the pain in his letters and the yearning in his writings suggest that he wished it could be otherwise. He was learning what freedom costs, and the price was almost more than he could bear. In April 1882, in Rome, Friedrich Nietzsche met Lou Andreas Salomé, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to hope for something he had never had. A life companion who could be intellectual equal and emotional partner. Lou was 21 years old, brilliant, beautiful, and independent. She had come from Russia to study in Zurich, unusual for a woman in that era, and had thrown herself into European intellectual life with unconventional freedom. She was interested in philosophy and religion, willing to question everything, drawn to radical ideas and radical thinkers. Nietzsche, 37 and profoundly lonely, fell in love. The meeting was arranged by Paul Ray, another philosopher and Nietzsche's friend, who had himself fallen in love with Lou. The three of them formed a triangular relationship, complicated from the start by the fact that both men wanted Lou, while she wanted intellectual companionship without romantic commitment. They conceived a plan to live together in Vienna or Paris, a community of free spirits pursuing philosophy together. Lou would study with both of them, they would write and discuss ideas, they would create an alternative to conventional social arrangements. There was even a photograph taken in Lucerne. Lou sitting in a small cart holding a whip, Nietzsche and Ray harnessed to pull the cart like draft animals. The image was playful, but also revealing. Lou in control, the two men as servants to her will. Nietzsche quickly moved from intellectual admiration to something much deeper. He proposed marriage, or something like marriage, offering to share his life and his philosophy with her. Lou was torn. She admired Nietzsche's mind, was fascinated by his ideas, wanted to learn from him, but she did not love him romantically and had no interest in conventional marriage or sexual relationships. She wanted independence, not attachment. She wanted intellectual exchange, not domestic partnership. The summer of 1882 became increasingly strained and painful. The three of them travelled together through Switzerland and Italy, ostensibly happy, but actually in turmoil. Ray was jealous of Nietzsche's intensity and intellect. Nietzsche was jealous of Ray's easier manner and his existing friendship with Lou. Lou tried to maintain the intellectual communion while refusing the emotional demands. Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who despised Lou as an immoral seductress, spread rumours and made trouble. The situation became impossible. In the conversations with Lou during these months, Nietzsche shared ideas he was developing for his next book. He spoke about eternal recurrence, about Amor Fati, about the possibility of living without metaphysical consolation. Lou understood what he was trying to say, perhaps better than anyone else had. She grasped the stakes, the difficulty, the profound challenge of his philosophy. For Nietzsche, this was intoxicating. Finally, someone who could keep up, who could grasp what he meant without endless explanation, who could be a genuine partner in thinking. He allowed himself to imagine a future where he would not be alone. But Lou was clear about her boundaries. She valued Nietzsche as a thinker, but could not love him as he wanted to be loved. In November 1882, in Leipzig, the arrangement fell apart. Lou and Ray decided to go to Berlin without Nietzsche. They would set up their intellectual household without him. Nietzsche was devastated. He had proposed marriage or partnership twice, possibly 3 times, and been rejected each time. The woman who was supposed to become his intellectual companion had chosen to exclude him. The loneliness he had hoped to escape became even more acute because now he knew what he was missing. The aftermath was ugly. Elizabeth spread vicious gossip about Lou's morals and motivations. Nietzsche wrote bitter accusatory letters to Lou and Ray, then apologized, then accused again. He felt betrayed not just emotionally but intellectually. They had taken his ideas, learned from him, then discarded him. Lou and Ray defended themselves, claimed they had never promised what Nietzsche demanded, accused him of trying to control and possess rather than truly collaborate. Both sides were partly right and partly self-deceiving. By early 1883, Nietzsche was in one of the darkest periods of his life. The rejection by Lou, combined with the continuing isolation, the physical suffering, the lack of recognition for his work, brought him to the edge of suicide. He wrote to Overbeck that he had obtained significant quantities of opium and considered using them to end his suffering. Only the prospect of not having completed his philosophical project held him back. He felt he had something to say that no one else could say, a diagnosis and a possibility that the world needed, even if the world did not know it yet. What emerged from this crisis was Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In February 1883, in Rapallo on the Italian Riviera, in 10 days of feverish work, Nietzsche wrote the first part. It poured out of him like a torrent, words coming faster than he could write them down. The book was unlike anything he or anyone else had written, a philosophical prose poem, a parody of the Bible, a prophet's proclamation of new values. Zarathustra came down from his mountain to teach humanity, to proclaim the death of God and the possibility of the Übermensch, to challenge humanity to overcome itself. The book can be read in part as a response to the Lou debacle. The Übermensch is the one who can create meaning alone, who does not need another person to validate existence, who finds within himself the resources for affirmation. Eternal recurrence is the test. Would you will this life again, even with all its suffering, even with rejection and loneliness and failure? Amor Fati is the achievement, loving what is, including what was taken away, including what you never had. The book transforms personal pain into philosophical position. Loneliness is not mere lack, but the condition for independence. Suffering is not mere curse, but the price of profundity. But the pain was real. Lou was not just a symbol or a philosophical problem, she was a person Nietzsche loved and hoped to build a life with, and her rejection wounded him more deeply than anything else in his adult life. In some ways he never recovered. The dream of companionship, of shared intellectual life, of not being alone, that dream died with Lou's departure. For the remaining productive years of his life, Nietzsche would not seriously pursue another romantic relationship. He would remain what he had been before Lou, solitary, wandering, locked in his own thoughts. Lou would go on to have a remarkable career: psychoanalyst, writer, friend of Rilke and Freud, one of the most interesting intellectuals of her generation. She would write a book about Nietzsche later in life, offering her perspective on their relationship and his philosophy. She admired him without reservation, understood him better than most, but maintained that she had been right to refuse him. Their relationship could not have worked, she believed, because Nietzsche needed absolute devotion and she needed absolute freedom. Perhaps she was right. Or perhaps Nietzsche's philosophy of loneliness was as much result as cause, a way of making virtue of necessity, of transforming rejection into liberation. The question haunts his later work: is the free spirit necessarily alone, or is freedom compatible with love and connection? Nietzsche sometimes wrote as if solitude was essential to greatness, as if any deep relationship would compromise independence. But he also wrote with yearning for understanding and companionship, for someone who could grasp what he was trying to say and affirm it. The contradiction was never resolved because the life that might have resolved it never materialized. Lou was the closest he came, and Lou chose otherwise. In the winter of 1883, staying in a small room in Rapallo overlooking the Mediterranean, Friedrich Nietzsche experienced what he described as a 10-day explosion of creativity. He wrote the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in one continuous burst, words flowing faster than he could write them down, as if the book were composing itself through him rather than being composed by him. The result was unlike anything he had written before, unlike anything in philosophical literature: a prose poem, a philosophical prophecy, a parody of scripture that was also deadly serious. He called it a gift, a book for everyone and no one. Everyone because its themes were universal, no one because hardly anyone would understand it. Thus Spoke Zarathustra tells the story of a prophet who descends from his mountain solitude to teach humanity about the death of God and what must come after. The title deliberately echoes the biblical "Thus spoke the Lord," but the message is the opposite of Scripture. Where the Bible offers divine commandments and promises of salvation, Zarathustra offers human responsibility and earthly meaning. Where the prophets of old spoke for God, Zarathustra speaks against God, or rather speaks from beyond God, from a world where God is dead and humanity must create its own values. The book opens with Zarathustra's descent. He has spent 10 years in mountain solitude, growing in wisdom, and now wishes to share what he has learned. He encounters an old saint in the forest who has not heard that God is dead, who still praises God in solitude. Zarathustra does not tell him the truth. The old man is too old to bear it, but continues to the marketplace of the nearest town. There he proclaims his teaching: "I teach you the Übermensch. The human being is something that must be overcome. What have you done to overcome it?" The crowd does not understand. They mock him, ask for a spectacle rather than a teaching. A tightrope walker performs and falls to his death. Zarathustra takes the corpse on his shoulders and buries it, learning that the masses are not ready for his message. He must seek disciples, not crowds. He must find those rare individuals who can hear what he has to say. The book becomes Zarathustra's attempt to teach those capable of learning, his struggle with his own deepest thoughts, his ultimate failure to find anyone who truly understands. The central teachings are presented through speeches, parables, and symbolic episodes. Zarathustra teaches that humanity is a bridge between animal and Übermensch, that our dignity lies in being a transition rather than a goal. He introduces the concept of the last man, the one who has made everything small, who wants nothing but comfort and security, who blinks and thinks himself wise. The last man is the opposite of the Übermensch, the endpoint of decline rather than the beginning of ascent. When Zarathustra describes the last man to the crowd, they cry out that they want to become last men. They choose comfort over greatness, security over risk, easy happiness over difficult nobility. Against this, Zarathustra sets the image of the Übermensch as the meaning of the earth. He calls on his listeners to remain faithful to the earth, not to believe those who speak of otherworldly hopes. Once the sin against God was the greatest sin, but God died, and with him died those sinners. Now the sin is against the earth, to esteem the otherworldly higher than the meaning of the earth. The body is the great reason, Zarathustra teaches, wiser than the intellect that imagines itself separate from bodily existence. The three metamorphoses of the spirit provide a path to overcoming. First, the spirit becomes a camel, bearing the weight of tradition, accepting the thou shalt of inherited values, carrying the burden without question. This is necessary. One must know what one is rebelling against, must feel the full weight of tradition. But one cannot remain a camel. The spirit must become a lion, must learn to say I will against every thou shalt, must win the freedom to create new values. The lion roars its sacred no, its refusal of received truth, its claim to independence. But even the lion is not enough. Destruction and rebellion are not ends but transitions. The spirit must finally become a child, capable of saying yes to life, capable of new beginning, capable of creating values out of innocence rather than reaction. The child is forgetfulness and new beginning, a game, a self-propelling wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. Creation requires becoming as a child, not carrying burdens, not merely refusing them, but playing, creating joyfully, affirming existence without resentment or calculation. The Übermensch is the one who completes this process, who overcomes the human as it has been. But Nietzsche is careful. The Übermensch is not a racial concept, not a biological type, not a political program. It is a direction, a possibility, an ideal toward which one strives without ever fully reaching. The Übermensch creates values rather than receiving them, says yes to life, including its suffering, finds meaning in earthly existence rather than otherworldly compensation. Most crucially, the Übermensch does not need God, does not need guarantees or foundations or ultimate purposes. He can bear the responsibility of creating meaning in a meaningless universe. Eternal recurrence appears as the book's deepest thought, the one Zarathustra himself struggles to bear. In the section called The Convalescent, Zarathustra's animals, an eagle and a serpent, tell him that he teaches eternal recurrence. Everything goes, everything returns. The wheel of existence rolls eternally. What has been returns, you yourself return, not to a new life, but to this same life with every joy and every pain recurring infinitely. Zarathustra responds with horror and nausea. Even the small man returns eternally. Even everything petty and meaningless and disappointing repeats forever. This is the test. Can you love your life enough to want it again, exactly as it has been, eternally? Can you say yes not just to the peaks but to the valleys, not just to success but to failure, not just to joy but to suffering? Eternal recurrence separates those who truly affirm life from those who merely tolerate it. If the thought fills you with horror, your life requires changing. If the thought fills you with joy, you have achieved Amor Fati, the love of fate, the supreme affirmation that wants nothing different. The book's style is biblical parody, deliberately echoing scripture while inverting its message. Where the Bible proclaims, "Thus saith the Lord," Zarathustra proclaims human responsibility. Where scripture promises heaven, Zarathustra celebrates earth. Where religious texts demand faith, Zarathustra demands courage. The rhythm is often liturgical, with repetitions and refrains that create an incantatory effect. But the content is anti-religious, a sustained argument against otherworldly hopes and transcendent meanings. Zarathustra also speaks in riddles and parables, sometimes obscure to the point of impenetrability. Nietzsche intended this difficulty. He believed profound truths could not be stated plainly, but required interpretation, struggle, active engagement from readers. The obscurity is partly protection. Those not ready for the teaching will not grasp it, and therefore will not be harmed by it. It is also invitation. Those capable of understanding will work through the difficulty and make the teaching their own, rather than merely accepting it on authority. The book was written in 4 parts over 2 years. The first part came in that explosive 10-day period in 1883. The second part followed later the same year, written in the Swiss summer. The third part came in 1884, the fourth in 1885. Each part goes deeper, becomes stranger, pushes further into territory that makes readers uncomfortable. The fourth part was initially printed privately in only 40 copies because no publisher would accept it. Nietzsche distributed these copies to friends, hoping for understanding and finding mostly silence or incomprehension. The book's subtitle describes it perfectly: a book for all and none. For all because its themes, how to live, how to find meaning, how to face death, concern everyone. For none because almost no one was ready to hear its message. Zarathustra found few disciples in the book itself, and Nietzsche found few readers who grasped what he was attempting. The book sold fewer than 70 copies in its first 4 years. Critics either ignored it or dismissed it as mystical nonsense. Nietzsche's friends were polite but baffled. He had produced what he considered his masterpiece, his gift to humanity, and humanity responded with indifference. Yet Nietzsche remained convinced of the book's importance. He would later write in Ecce Homo that Zarathustra was the deepest book in German literature, that nothing like it had been written before. He compared it to Dante, to Goethe's Faust, to the Rig Veda. This was not mere vanity but conviction born of the experience of writing it. Something had happened in those days of composition, something Nietzsche experienced as gift rather than achievement, as inspiration rather than deliberate creation. Whether this was genius or the first signs of the mental breakdown that would come 6 years later, we cannot know. Perhaps it was both. The book's influence would come later, posthumously, when readers finally caught up to what Nietzsche had attempted. Zarathustra would become the most famous of Nietzsche's works, the one everyone recognized, even if few read it carefully. The images and phrases would enter popular culture: the Übermensch, the death of God, the eternal recurrence, the last man. But often these would be misunderstood, torn from context, used to support positions Nietzsche opposed. The Nazis would claim Nietzsche and the Übermensch for their racial ideology, despite everything Nietzsche wrote against nationalism and anti-Semitism. The book for everyone and no one would be claimed by everyone and understood by almost no one, The teaching of the three Metamorphoses stands near the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but it deserves fuller exploration because it maps the entire path from tradition to freedom to creation. Nietzsche presents spiritual development not as continuous growth, but as radical transformations, each requiring the death of what came before. One does not improve the camel to become a lion or refine the lion to become a child. Each metamorphosis is a break, a shedding of the previous form, a leap into something fundamentally different. The spirit first becomes a camel, Zarathustra teaches. The camel is the beast of burden, the one who bears weight. What is heavy? Asks the spirit. What is difficult? What requires strength and endurance? Give it to me, I will carry it. The camel spirit seeks the heaviest burdens, the burden of tradition, the weight of received wisdom, the difficulty of obedience to what others have determined is right and true and holy. The camel kneels to be loaded, accepts what is placed upon it, carries it into the desert without complaint. This is not cowardice, but strength of a particular kind. It requires power to bear what others cannot bear, to submit to discipline, to follow rules that demand sacrifice. The camel spirit masters traditional knowledge, learns what the culture teaches, internalizes the values of the community. This is necessary. One cannot rebel against what one does not know, cannot overcome what one has not first mastered. The dutiful student, the pious believer, the obedient citizen, these are camel spirits, and every person who will become free must first pass through this stage. But the camel must become a lion. In the loneliest desert, the second metamorphosis happens. The spirit who has borne all burdens now refuses to bear them longer. The lion confronts the dragon whose scales glitter with golden "Thou shalt" written on every scale. These are the values of millennia, the accumulated wisdom of tradition, everything the culture calls good and true and necessary. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt honour thy father and mother. Thou shalt worship God. 10,000 commandments, each one claiming absolute authority, each one demanding obedience. The lion says no. The lion roars its sacred no against every thou shalt. Where the dragon says all values have been created already, the lion fights for the freedom to create new values. This is not nihilistic destruction, but the necessary clearing of ground. One cannot build the new while buried under the weight of the old. One cannot think freely while bound by unquestioned commandments. The lion spirit questions everything, rejects inherited certainties, claims the right to think for itself without appealing to authority. This no is sacred because it liberates. The lion wins freedom from tradition, from external authority, from the tyranny of the thou shalt. But freedom from is not yet freedom for. The lion can destroy but cannot create. It can tear down but not build up. It knows what it rejects but not yet what it affirms. The roar of the lion clears space but does not fill that space with new content. One more metamorphosis is required. The spirit must finally become a child. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning. The child does not remember the weight of tradition because it has thrown it off. The child does not struggle against commandments because it no longer hears them. The child plays, creates, begins the sacred game of existence without resentment or calculation. What the lion won through struggle, the child possesses naturally. What required violent negation in the lion's stage becomes simple affirmation in the child's. The child says yes. Not the grudging yes of resignation or the desperate yes of faith seeking reassurance, but the spontaneous yes of joy, creativity, play. The child creates values as naturally as it plays games, without needing justification or guarantee. The child does not ask whether life has meaning. It creates meaning through living. The child does not require purposes given from beyond. It finds purpose in its own activity. The child affirms existence not despite its difficulty, but because existence is what it has, the only material for creation. Why must the child come last? Because creation requires innocence, not just freedom. The lion is still defined by what it opposes. Its no is powerful but reactive. The lion is angry, wounded by what tradition demanded, fighting against constraints. This anger is necessary but cannot be the end. One cannot create from resentment alone. The child, having forgotten what it overcame, creates from abundance rather than reaction, from joy rather than spite, from love of the possible rather than hatred of the actual. This teaching maps not only individual development, but cultural transformation. Western civilization has been for 2 millennia predominantly camel spirit, bearing the weight of Christian moral tradition, submitting to divine commandments, finding meaning in obedience to transcendent authority. The Enlightenment and modernity brought the lion, reason questioning revelation, science challenging dogma, individual conscience rejecting external authority. We live in the age of the lion, the age of critique and destruction, the sacred no against all inherited certainties. But the lion's work is not complete achievement, but necessary transition. We have questioned traditional morality without yet creating new values. We have destroyed belief in God without yet finding earthly meaning. We have liberated ourselves from commandments without yet determining how to live. This is the crisis Nietzsche diagnosed. We are lions who have not yet become children, free spirits who have won freedom from, but not yet freedom for. The question is whether we can make the final metamorphosis. Can we move beyond reactive critique to creative affirmation? Can we stop defining ourselves by what we oppose and begin defining ourselves by what we create? Can we say yes to existence without requiring it to justify itself by appeal to transcendent purposes? Can we love life not because it serves some higher end, but because it is what we have and it is enough? Nietzsche believed most people would not make this transition. Most would remain camels, clinging to traditional values, even though those values have lost their foundation. Others would become lions and remain lions, endlessly critical, always opposed, never affirming. The few who became children would be the free spirits, the creators of new values, the Übermenschen who could give meaning to existence without receiving it from beyond. The 3 Metamorphoses are also Nietzsche's autobiography. He was the little pastor, the camel spirit who bore the weight of Christian piety and classical scholarship. He became the lion who said no to Christianity, to Wagner, to metaphysics, to everything traditional philosophy assumed. The question he faced in writing Zarathustra was whether he could become the child, whether he could move beyond critique to creation, beyond negation to affirmation. The book itself is his attempt to make that metamorphosis, to say yes, to create rather than merely destroy. Whether he succeeded is for readers to judge. Some find in Zarathustra genuine affirmation, joyful wisdom, creative power. Others find continued anger, lingering resentment, critique disguised as creation. Perhaps the truth is that Nietzsche remained suspended between lion and child, able to glimpse the possibility of pure affirmation, but unable to fully embody it. Perhaps the suffering of his life, the loneliness and rejection and physical pain, made pure joy impossible. Or perhaps the child's innocence cannot be achieved by those who have lived as lion. Perhaps the forgetting required is incompatible with the philosophical consciousness that remembers everything it has overcome. The concept of the Übermensch stands at the center of Nietzsche's mature philosophy, and it is also the concept most frequently misunderstood and misused. The German word means literally over-person or beyond person, someone who has surpassed the merely human. English translations have used Superman or Overman, but both terms carry unfortunate connotations. Superman suggests a comic book hero with superhuman powers. Overman suggests domination over others. Neither captures what Nietzsche meant. The Übermensch is not a genetic or racial category, not a political program, not even an achievable goal, but a direction, a possibility, an ideal that pulls humanity forward. Zarathustra introduces the Übermensch in the book's opening speech. "I teach you the Übermensch," he tells the crowd in the marketplace. "The human being is something that must be overcome. What have you done to overcome it? All beings so far have created something beyond themselves, and you want to be the ebb of this great flood, rather than go beyond the human. What is the ape to a human being, a laughingstock or a painful embarrassment? And the human being shall be exactly that to the Übermensch, a laughingstock or a painful embarrassment. The Übermensch represents the meaning of the earth, the one who remains faithful to earthly existence rather than seeking otherworldly consolation. In traditional religion, life on earth was preparation for something else: heaven, paradise, union with God. Earth was exile, a veil of tears, something to be endured while waiting for true life to begin. The death of God makes this attitude impossible for honest thinkers. If there is no afterlife, no redemption beyond death, then earth is not preparation but the whole. The Übermensch accepts this fully, finding meaning in earthly life rather than longing for transcendence. This means creating values rather than receiving them. In the God-centered worldview, values came from beyond. God commanded what is good, prohibited what is evil, determined how life should be lived. Morality was discovered, not created. But if God is dead, values have no transcendent foundation. They are human creations, arising from human needs and interests and perspectives. The Übermensch recognizes this and takes responsibility for creating values, for determining what is noble and base, beautiful and ugly, worth pursuing and worth avoiding. This is not arbitrary relativism, as if all values were equally valid. Nietzsche believed some perspectives were richer, healthier, more life-affirming than others. The Übermensch creates values that enhance life, that promote flourishing, that enable human greatness. These values will look different from traditional religious morality because they arise from different sources. Where Christian morality emphasizes humility, self-denial, and submission, Übermensch values might emphasize pride, self-affirmation, and independence. Where Christian morality seeks to minimize suffering, Übermensch values might see suffering as necessary for growth and achievement. The Übermensch says yes to life, including its terrible aspects. This is perhaps the most important characteristic. Life includes suffering, loss, failure, disappointment, death. The traditional religious response was to explain suffering as punishment for sin or test of faith, and to promise compensation in the afterlife. The pessimistic philosophical response, exemplified by Schopenhauer, was to say that suffering reveals life's fundamental negativity and we should therefore deny the will to live. The Übermensch responds differently. Suffering is real, but it is part of life, and life including its suffering is worth affirming. This affirmation is Amor Fati, the love of fate, wanting nothing to be different. Not resignation, not gritting one's teeth and enduring, but actual love of what is including what seems terrible. This sounds impossible, perhaps even perverse. How can one love loss and failure and pain? Nietzsche's answer involves seeing one's life as a whole, as an artwork, as a narrative where even the dark moments are necessary for the story's meaning. Would you remove the suffering even if it meant becoming someone else, someone who had never suffered? The Übermensch would not. The Übermensch embraces the whole, affirms the necessity of everything that happened, loves fate rather than wishes it otherwise. The eternal recurrence functions as the test for this affirmation. Imagine you must live your life again, exactly as it has been, infinitely many times. Every pain repeats eternally, but so does every joy. You cannot edit or improve. You get everything again, forever. The question is whether this thought fills you with horror or with joy. If horror, you do not yet love your life fully, do not yet affirm existence completely. If joy, you have achieved the Übermensch's affirmation, the supreme yes to life. Against the Übermensch stands the last man, humanity's most contemptible possible future. The last man has made everything small. He seeks only comfort, security, entertainment, health. He wants nothing challenging or dangerous. He has small pleasures, asks no difficult questions, tolerates everything because nothing matters enough to fight for. When Zarathustra describes the last man to the crowd, they respond enthusiastically, "Give us this last man. Let us become these creatures who want only easy happiness and call it wisdom." The last man is the end point of a certain kind of progress. Modern civilization promises to make life comfortable, safe, pleasant. It seeks to eliminate suffering, risk, danger, difficulty. It offers entertainment instead of meaning, distraction instead of purpose, comfort instead of achievement. This is presented as humanitarian concern, as improvement of the human condition. But Nietzsche saw it as decline, as the breeding of humanity downward toward mediocrity. The last man is healthy, happy, and utterly contemptible, because nothing about him is great or admirable. The choice civilization faces is between the last man and the Übermensch. Will we breed humanity downward toward safety and comfort, or forward toward danger and greatness? Will we value security above all, or will we value achievement even at the cost of security? Will we seek to minimize suffering even if that means minimizing excellence, or will we accept suffering as the price of human flourishing? Nietzsche clearly believed modern civilization was choosing the last man, was becoming herd animals content with mediocrity. The Übermensch cannot be bred or produced through policy. It emerges through individuals taking responsibility for their own development, for overcoming themselves, for creating values without guarantee or authority. Such individuals will be rare. Most will remain herd animals following conventional values. The few who risk independence, who face the abyss of meaninglessness and create meaning anyway, who say yes to life despite everything, these approach the Übermensch ideal. They are not perfect beings, but struggling, suffering, courageous individuals who give meaning to existence through their striving. It is crucial to understand what the Übermensch is not. It is not racial supremacy. Nietzsche despised racial thinking, explicitly rejected anti-Semitism, had contempt for German nationalism. His sister Elizabeth and the Nazi appropriation of his work tried to make the Übermensch into Aryan supremacy, but nothing in Nietzsche's texts supports this reading. The Übermensch is spiritual and cultural, not biological. Anyone of any race or nationality could in principle become Übermensch through their own development. The Übermensch is not political domination. Nietzsche did not advocate that superior individuals should rule over inferior ones. He was not interested in political arrangements or social policy. The Übermensch's greatness is personal and cultural, not political. The Übermensch creates values and artworks and ideas, not governments or empires. The Übermensch is not cruelty or callousness. Nietzsche attacked pity as a virtue, but he himself was moved to tears by suffering. His critique was of systematic pity, of making pity into the highest value, of valuing others only as victims to be pitied. He wanted human greatness to be valued more than human vulnerability. But this did not mean enjoying others' suffering or inflicting pain needlessly. The Übermensch's strength is self-mastery and creativity, not violence toward others. What the Übermensch represents ultimately is possibility. Can humanity create meaning without divine foundations? Can we say yes to life without requiring cosmic justification? Can we overcome the nihilism that follows from the death of God? Nietzsche believed we could, that some rare individuals already did, that the Übermensch was not fantasy but emerging reality. Whether he was right remains to be seen. The question he posed, what comes after God, what emerges from nihilism's abyss, is still our question. In section 341 of The Gay Science, titled The Greatest Weight, Nietzsche introduces what would become the central thought of his mature philosophy. The passage is worth quoting because it captures both the horror and the possibility contained in the idea. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine'? This is eternal recurrence, and it operates on multiple levels in Nietzsche's thought. At one level, it is a cosmological hypothesis about the nature of time and existence. If the universe contains finite matter and energy in eternal time, and if time is infinite, then every possible configuration must repeat infinitely. We have lived this exact life before and will live it again, eternally, in exact detail. Nothing changes, nothing develops, everything returns. Nietzsche sometimes presented this as a physical theory, something that might be scientifically demonstrated. He made notes about consulting physicists, about formulating mathematical proofs, about establishing eternal recurrence as objective fact. But the more important level is existential and ethical. Eternal recurrence functions as a test of life affirmation. Do you love your life enough to want it again, exactly as it has been, eternally? Not an improved version, not an edited version with the painful parts removed. This life, with all its suffering and disappointment and failure, repeating forever without change. The question separates two fundamental attitudes toward existence. Those who would curse the demon, who find the thought unbearable, reveal that they do not truly love their lives. They tolerate existence perhaps, or endure it, or find compensations that make it worthwhile. But they do not wholeheartedly affirm it. Those who would bless the demon, who would call him a god for revealing this thought, have achieved something rare and difficult. Amor Fati, the love of fate. They want nothing to be different. They do not wish they had made different choices, lived differently, been spared certain experiences. They affirm everything that happened as necessary for them to become who they are. Even the suffering, even the losses, even the failures. These too they affirm because removing them would mean ceasing to be themselves. The thought of eternal recurrence becomes the formula for affirmation. If you can will this moment again eternally, you have achieved the supreme yes-saying to life. This makes eternal recurrence deeply personal. It is not about whether the universe actually repeats. It is about your relationship to your own existence. Can you say yes to it completely? Or do you harbour reservations, regrets, wishes that things had been otherwise? The honest answer for most people is that they would curse the demon. There are moments and experiences we would erase if we could, choices we wish we could unmake, suffering we would avoid if given the chance. This reveals that we have not yet achieved full life affirmation, that we still judge existence and find parts of it wanting. Nietzsche connected eternal recurrence to the death of God. When God existed, life could be justified by reference to divine purposes and ultimate redemption. Suffering was explicable as divine test or punishment for sin and would be compensated in heaven. Life was preparation for something else, something better. But if God is dead, there is no compensation, no redemption, no meaning given from beyond. This life is all there is. The question becomes whether this life, just as it is, without transcendent justification, is worth living. Eternal recurrence forces the question, is this life good enough that you would accept it eternally? The thought has a selective function. It separates the life-affirming from the life-denying, the ascending from the declining, the healthy from the sick. Those who can bear the thought are strong enough to face existence without illusions or compensations. They do not need otherworldly hopes, do not require that suffering be explained or justified, do not demand that life serve some higher purpose. Life itself, in its immediacy and particularity, is enough. Those who cannot bear the thought reveal their weakness, their secret wish that life were other than it is, their need for consoling lies. But Nietzsche also struggled with the thought himself. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when Zarathustra's animals tell him that he teaches eternal recurrence, he responds with nausea and horror. The thought that even the small man returns eternally, that all the pettiness and mediocrity and suffering repeats without end. This thought is abysmal, vertiginous, almost unendurable. Zarathustra must convalescence, must learn to bear his own teaching. This struggle suggests that eternal recurrence is not easy wisdom, but terrible knowledge, something that requires immense strength to accept. The biographical context deepens the thought's power. Nietzsche's life included extraordinary loneliness, chronic illness, professional failure, rejection by the one woman he loved, misunderstanding by almost everyone he encountered. He was asking himself, would I will this life again, eternally, with all its suffering? The fact that he could entertain the thought, could work toward affirming it, shows remarkable courage. Most people with happy lives might accept their repetition. Nietzsche, with his suffering life, worked toward accepting it, toward loving even the painful parts as necessary for the whole. Some interpreters read eternal recurrence as purely selective, as a thought experiment that tells you something about yourself but makes no claims about reality. If the thought fills you with horror, change your life. If it fills you with joy, you are living well. Others read it as cosmological claim that Nietzsche believed true about the universe. Still others see it as ethical imperative. Live in such a way that you could will your life's eternal recurrence, make every moment worthy of repetition. All three readings find support in Nietzsche's texts, and perhaps he intended all three. The relationship to Amor Fati is intimate. Amor Fati means loving fate, wanting nothing to be different, affirming necessity. Eternal recurrence makes this concrete and testable. Do you love your fate enough to want it eternally? The yes to eternal recurrence is the yes to fate, the affirmation of everything that happened as necessary and valuable. This is not resignation, but something more active, the transformation of "it was" into "thus I willed it." To will backward, to redeem the past by affirming it rather than regretting it, is the highest achievement of the will. Critics have pointed out that the thought seems harsh, even cruel. What about lives filled with undeserved suffering, with torture and abuse and trauma? How can one demand that victims affirm their suffering eternally? Nietzsche might respond that he is not demanding anything, merely posing the question. But there is something troubling in the teaching, something that seems to blame those who cannot affirm their suffering for weakness rather than recognizing that some suffering really is unjust and unbearable. Nietzsche's own suffering was of a particular kind: illness, loneliness, professional disappointment, but not torture or systematic oppression. Whether his teaching applies equally to all forms of suffering is questionable. Yet the power of the thought remains. It forces radical honesty about one's relationship to existence. It makes visible the hidden resentment, the secret wish that things were otherwise, the ways we fail to fully inhabit our lives. It challenges the comfortable belief that we can pick and choose from our existence, keeping the pleasant parts and discarding the painful ones. The thought says, you are a whole, your life is a unity, you get all of it or none of it. Will you accept all of it? Will you embrace even what you would rather forget? Nietzsche believed that only through such acceptance could humanity move beyond the death of God. If we still harbour wishes for transcendence, still long for otherworldly redemption, still judge existence by whether it serves some higher purpose, we have not truly overcome religious thinking. We remain, in essence, Christians without Christianity, nihilists who have not yet faced nihilism's full implications. Eternal recurrence is the thought that makes overcoming possible, the test that reveals whether we have achieved genuinely earthly affirmation. In 1886, 4 years after completing the main parts of Zarathustra, Nietzsche published Beyond Good and Evil, subtitled Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. The book marked a return to aphoristic style after Zarathustra's prophetic prose. It was more direct, more argumentative, more accessible, though still difficult and provocative. The central theme was the genealogy of morals, the question of where our values come from and whether we should continue to hold them. Nietzsche was preparing the ground for his most systematic work on the genealogy of morals, which would follow the next year. The title itself announces a provocation. Beyond good and evil does not mean anything goes or moral nihilism. It means getting beyond one particular moral framework, the framework that divides actions into good and evil, as if these were absolute categories given by God or discovered through reason. Nietzsche wanted to question this framework itself, to ask how it arose and whom it serves. He wanted to imagine moralities plural rather than morality singular, to recognize that what one culture calls good, another might call evil, and that these differences are not errors to be corrected, but perspectives to be understood. The book's first section attacks philosophers for their dogmatism and lack of historical sense. Every philosophy, Nietzsche argues, is autobiography. Philosophers claim to seek truth objectively, but actually they defend positions they already hold for reasons they do not acknowledge. Behind every philosophy stands a particular person with particular needs, fears, and resentments. Plato's theory of forms reflects his fear of change and decay. Kant's categorical imperative reflects his Protestant upbringing. Schopenhauer's pessimism reflects his personal disappointment. This does not make philosophy useless, but it means philosophy should be read as symptom and expression, not as disinterested truth. Nietzsche introduces the crucial distinction between master morality and slave morality. These are not two groups of people, but two fundamentally different ways of creating values. Master morality begins with self-affirmation. The powerful, noble, aristocratic types look at themselves and say, "We are good," meaning noble, excellent, admirable. Everything that resembles them is good. What differs from them is bad, meaning low, common, contemptible. Bad is not evil, not something that should be punished or eliminated, just what is not us. Master morality creates values from a position of power and affirmation. Slave morality begins with resentment of the powerful. Those who lack power, who suffer under domination, who feel themselves oppressed, look at their masters and say, "You are evil." Evil here means genuinely wicked, deserving of punishment and condemnation, morally corrupt. Whatever the masters value, strength, pride, power, becomes evil. Whatever the slaves have, weakness, humility, submission, becomes good. Slave morality inverts the values of master morality, making virtues of necessities. Unable to become powerful, slaves declare power evil. Unable to become proud, they declare pride sin. Unable to retaliate directly, they retaliate through moral condemnation. Christian morality, Nietzsche argues, is the fullest expression of slave morality in history. Christianity took the values of the powerless, meekness, humility, compassion, self-denial, and declared them the highest virtues. It took the values of the powerful, pride, strength, worldly success, and declared them sins. It promised that the last shall be first, that the meek shall inherit the earth, that those who suffer now will rejoice in heaven. This was not innocent moral teaching, but a massive revaluation of values, a slave revolt in morality that succeeded in overthrowing pagan aristocratic values and imposing slave values on Western civilization. Nietzsche is careful to note that this revaluation was creative, even admirable in its way. It took genuine ingenuity to transform weakness into virtue, to make suffering seem noble, to convince people that self-denial was higher than self-affirmation. The priests who accomplished this were psychologically sophisticated, understanding how to channel resentment into moral systems, how to make people feel guilty for their natural instincts, how to gain power through claiming powerlessness. Christianity is not simple error, but a successful strategy, and its success has shaped Western culture for 2 millennia. But the cost has been enormous. Slave morality is fundamentally life-denying. It values traits that minimize life, that make people smaller, weaker, more submissive. It turns natural instincts into sins. Pride becomes pride, requiring humility. Anger becomes wrath, requiring forgiveness. Desire becomes lust, requiring chastity. It teaches people to distrust themselves, to see their own vitality as dangerous, to seek salvation by becoming less than they are. The herd morality that results produces compliant, guilty, self-denying individuals who dare not trust their own judgment or pursue their own excellence. Nietzsche contrasts this with pre-Christian pagan moralities that he associates with master morality. The Greeks and Romans valued strength, courage, nobility, excellence. They honored the hero, the warrior, the one who achieved great deeds. They were not egalitarian but aristocratic, not compassionate but proud, not humble but self-affirming. Whether Nietzsche's historical account is accurate is debatable. Greek and Roman moralities were more complex than he suggests, but his philosophical point stands. Different value systems are possible, and we should ask which promotes human flourishing rather than assuming our current values are absolute. The section on the free spirit describes the kind of person who can live beyond good and evil. The free spirit has liberated himself from herd morality, does not accept conventional values as binding, creates his own values based on his own judgment and experience. He is not immoral, but unmoral, standing outside the moral framework rather than transgressing it. He recognizes that values are human creations and takes responsibility for creating his own values. This is difficult, lonely, dangerous work. The free spirit has no community, no external validation, no certainty that he is right, but he also has genuine independence, genuine freedom to think and value as he chooses. Beyond Good and Evil also attacks nationalism, anti-Semitism, and German culture. Nietzsche saw German nationalism as herd mentality at its worst, mass sentiment requiring individual submission to collective identity. He despised anti-Semitism as resentment and scapegoating. He admired Jewish intellectual achievement while noting the role of Jewish priests in developing slave morality. He wanted a Europe beyond nations, a culture beyond tribalism, individuals beyond their assigned group identities. This made him deeply unpopular with his contemporaries and would later be willfully ignored by Nazi appropriations of his work. The book received little attention when first published. Critics who noticed it were often hostile. Sales were poor. Nietzsche had hoped for breakthrough recognition, but instead found continued indifference. He published Beyond Good and Evil at his own expense because no publisher would take it. He sent copies to influential figures hoping for engagement, but received mostly silence. The philosophy he considered most important was ignored by those he hoped to reach. The isolation deepened. But he continued working, convinced that future readers would understand what contemporaries could not grasp. In 1887, Nietzsche published On the Genealogy of Morals, subtitled A Polemic. It consisted of 3 essays that together formed his most sustained and systematic argument about the origins and nature of morality. Unlike his usual aphoristic style, the Genealogy offered consecutive reasoning, careful analysis of historical development, and explicit engagement with opposing views. If any work showed that Nietzsche could write systematic philosophy when he chose, this was it. The result was his most powerful and influential work, the one that established genealogy as a philosophical method. The first essay, Good and Evil, Good and Bad, developed the master-slave morality distinction introduced in Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche began by rejecting English moral psychologists who claimed morality arose from utility, that we call actions good because they benefit society. This gets causation backward, Nietzsche argued. We do not call actions good because they are useful. Rather, the powerful called themselves good, and what benefits them then became defined as useful and valuable. The origin of morality is not rational evaluation, but the self-affirmation of the powerful. The noble, aristocratic types looked at themselves and declared, "We are good," meaning noble, excellent, high-born, beautiful. This was not a judgment based on actions but on being. They were good by virtue of what they were, powerful, free, capable of action, living according to their own nature. What differed from them was bad, low, common, contemptible. But bad was not evil in the moral sense, not deserving of punishment, just inferior, vulgar, not worth thinking about. The nobles distinguished themselves from the rabble, but did not condemn the rabble morally. They simply ignored or despised what was beneath them. Slave morality arose as a reaction against this noble self-affirmation. Those who lacked power, who suffered under noble domination, who could not match the nobles in strength or freedom, felt resentment. This resentment was creative, Nietzsche insisted. From it emerged a complete revaluation of values. The slaves looked at their masters and said, "You are evil." Evil became the primary concept, and good was defined as everything the masters were not. Where the masters were proud, the slaves called humility good. Where the masters were strong, the slaves called meekness good. Where the masters were free, the slaves called obedience good. This was ressentiment, Nietzsche's term for the creative hatred of the powerless. Ressentiment literally means resentment, but Nietzsche used it with specific meaning, not momentary anger, but deep, festering hatred that cannot express itself in direct action and therefore turns inward, becomes creative, transforms values themselves. The man of ressentiment cannot act directly against those he hates, so he acts through moral condemnation, through making the powerful feel guilty, through establishing a value system where the weak are virtuous and the strong are evil. The priests were the masterminds of this revaluation, particularly the Jewish priests who developed monotheistic morality. Nietzsche was not making crude anti-Semitic claims here. He admired Jewish intelligence and psychological sophistication. His point was historical and genealogical. The Jewish people, politically powerless but intellectually powerful, developed a moral system that revalued suffering and made the oppressed morally superior to the oppressors. Christianity then spread this moral revolution throughout the Roman Empire and eventually throughout the world. It was the greatest slave revolt in history, and it succeeded completely in overthrowing pagan values and imposing Judeo-Christian values on the West. The second essay, Guilt, Bad Conscience and Related Matters, examined how morality became internalized. Originally, morality was external, social rules enforced by punishment. But over time, these external constraints became internalized, as conscience, as inner voice commanding and forbidding. How did this happen? Through a process Nietzsche described in quasi-historical terms, though the account was more conceptual than empirical. When humans became civilized, when they formed societies with laws and hierarchies, their animal instincts could no longer be directly expressed. The aggressive, cruel, dominating instincts that had been directed outward against enemies now had nowhere to go. Society demanded peace, cooperation, obedience. But the instincts remained, pressing for expression. Unable to express themselves outward, they turned inward. Humans became cruel to themselves, developed the capacity for self-torture, invented the bad conscience. Bad conscience is the internalization of cruelty. It is the pleasure in making oneself suffer, the satisfaction of self-condemnation, the joy of finding oneself guilty. This sounds perverse until we recognize how much of human psychology consists of exactly this. The voice that tells us we are not good enough, that criticizes our every action, that finds fault and assigns blame. This is not rational moral evaluation, but cruelty toward oneself, the same instinct that once found pleasure in making others suffer, now finding pleasure in self-torment. Christianity took this bad conscience and gave it theological interpretation. You feel guilty, Christianity said, because you are guilty. Guilty of original sin, guilty before God, deserving of damnation. Your suffering is just punishment for moral corruption. The only escape is through divine grace, through accepting Christ's sacrifice, through becoming what God demands rather than what you naturally are. Christianity did not create bad conscience, but it intensified it, gave it cosmic significance, made it the center of spiritual life. The result was guilt as the dominant human emotion, self-hatred as the path to redemption. Nietzsche saw this as psychological disaster. Bad conscience is not moral progress, but sickness, the turning of healthy instincts against themselves. The ideal would be to overcome bad conscience, to stop torturing oneself with guilt, to reclaim the energy currently spent on self-condemnation and redirect it toward creative self-affirmation. But this is difficult because bad conscience has become so deeply ingrained, so much a part of what we consider moral and civilized. To overcome it would require overcoming 2 millennia of Christian conditioning. The third essay, What Do Ascetic Ideals Mean?, examined the appeal of self-denial, suffering, and renunciation. Why do people embrace values that require them to deny their own nature, to make themselves suffer, to renounce pleasure and vitality? The ascetic ideal appears in many forms. The priest who takes vows of chastity and poverty, the philosopher who renounces worldly concerns for pure contemplation, the artist who suffers for his art, the scientist who denies his own prejudices in service of truth. All embody the same basic stance, saying no to immediate life in service of something supposedly higher. Nietzsche's diagnosis was that the ascetic ideal represents a will to nothingness, unable to embrace life with all its messiness and suffering, unable to say yes to existence as it is. Humans invent otherworldly ideals and sacrifice actual life for imaginary perfection. The ascetic says that this world is corrupt, this body is sinful, this life is worthless. True value lies in the spiritual, the eternal, the pure, the otherworldly. By devaluing the actual in favour of the ideal, the ascetic makes current suffering bearable while ensuring continued suffering through self-denial. But why would this appeal to anyone? Nietzsche's answer was that the ascetic ideal gives meaning to suffering. Suffering without meaning is unbearable. What humans cannot stand is not suffering itself, but meaningless suffering. The ascetic ideal tells suffering humans that their suffering means something, that it serves a purpose, that through suffering one approaches the divine or achieves spiritual purity. Better to will nothingness than not to will at all. Better to embrace self-denial as meaningful than to face the possibility that suffering has no meaning, that existence serves no purpose, that the world is indifferent to human hopes. This explained the power of Christianity and similar religions. They do not minimize suffering, but give it meaning. They tell suffering humans that suffering is not pointless, but redemptive, not accident, but test, not meaningless, but meaningful. This makes life bearable even when conditions are terrible. The price is the devaluation of actual life, the constant message that what exists is not enough, that true value lies elsewhere, that we should long for escape rather than embrace what is. Nietzsche's critique was not that ascetic ideals are errors, they are strategies, solutions to the problem of meaningless suffering, ways of making unbearable existence bearable. They work in their way, but they come at terrible cost. The systematic denial of life, the devaluation of earth for heaven, the transformation of healthy instincts into sins. The question is whether we can find different solutions, whether we can make suffering bearable without requiring otherworldly meaning, whether we can say yes to life including its terrible aspects. The genealogy ended without clear resolution. Nietzsche had exposed the origins of morality, shown that our values have histories, demonstrated that what we consider natural and absolute is actually constructed and contingent. But he had not yet fully articulated what should replace slave morality and the ascetic ideal. That work was still ahead, in the books he would write in the final year of productive life before the collapse. Ressentiment stands as one of Nietzsche's most important psychological discoveries, a concept that explains how the powerless gain power through moral condemnation. The French word, retained by Nietzsche rather than using the German equivalent, carries connotations of festering resentment, of grudges nursed in secret, of hatred that cannot express itself in action and therefore turns creative, inventing new ways to strike at its targets. Ressentiment is not momentary anger or justified indignation, but a permanent state of soul, a way of relating to the world, a fundamental orientation toward existence. The man of ressentiment is defined by what he opposes rather than by what he affirms. He does not look at himself and say, "I am good," but looks at others and says, "You are evil." His values are reactive rather than creative, negative rather than positive. He needs enemies, needs someone to blame, needs to explain his suffering by identifying those responsible. Without the evil ones to condemn, his entire value system collapses because it consists of nothing but condemnation. He is not for something but against something, and his identity depends on maintaining this opposition. This explains the peculiar intensity of moral condemnation in slave morality. The ressentiment-driven person does not merely disagree with those he considers evil. He hates them with consuming passion, sees them as fundamentally corrupt, insists on their damnation. This is because his own sense of value depends on their evilness. If the powerful are not evil, then the powerless are simply weak. If strength is not sin, then weakness is not virtue. The entire revaluation of values depends on maintaining absolute condemnation of the masters, on insisting that their very existence is moral outrage. Nietzsche traced ressentiment through Western history. It appeared in the Jewish prophets who condemned their oppressors and promised divine revenge. It flourished in early Christianity, with its beatitudes blessing the meek and cursing the rich and powerful. It expressed itself in medieval Christianity's obsession with sin and damnation. It survived into modern secular morality through concepts of exploitation, oppression, and social justice. Not all moral criticism involves ressentiment, but when moral language serves primarily to express impotent hatred rather than to promote genuine flourishing, ressentiment is at work. The psychology of ressentiment is complex. The ressentiment-driven person cannot admit that he resents the powerful because of his own weakness. He must convince himself that his condemnation is righteous, that he opposes evil rather than envies strength. He must believe his own moral narrative, that the powerful are evil and therefore deserve punishment, that the weak are good and therefore deserve elevation. This self-deception is essential. If he recognized his values as arising from envy and impotence, the values would lose their moral force. They must appear as objective truth, as divine command, as rational conclusion. This makes ressentiment difficult to overcome. One cannot simply tell the ressentiment-driven person that his values arise from weakness. He will deny it, will become more insistent about the righteousness of his position, will see the criticism itself as proof of the critic's evil. Ressentiment creates a closed system, a worldview that interprets all opposition as confirmation. If you agree that the powerful are evil, this proves the ressentiment-driven person is right. If you disagree, this proves you are evil yourself, probably in league with the oppressors. There is no way to argue someone out of ressentiment, because ressentiment is not a conclusion reached through argument, but an orientation toward existence arising from weakness. Nietzsche distinguished ressentiment from legitimate criticism of genuine injustice. Not all opposition to the powerful is ressentiment. Sometimes power is abused, sometimes the strong do oppress the weak, sometimes resistance is justified and necessary. The difference lies in the spirit of the opposition. Does it arise from strength or weakness? Does it seek to create something new or merely to destroy what exists? Does it affirm its own values or merely negate the values of others? Does it aim at genuine flourishing or merely at revenge? The Christian commandment to love one's enemies reveals ressentiment's cunning. On the surface, this sounds like the opposite of ressentiment, like overcoming hatred through love. But Nietzsche saw it as ressentiment at its most sophisticated. You cannot strike back at your enemies physically, so you strike back morally by claiming to love them while actually condemning them. You make them feel guilty for being strong, for being happy, for being what you cannot be. Your love is poisoned by the implicit message, I am morally superior because I love you despite your evil. The powerless gain moral power by claiming virtue through their very powerlessness. Modern movements of social justice, in Nietzsche's framework, must be examined for ressentiment. This does not mean all such movements are driven by ressentiment or that inequality and oppression are not real problems. It means asking whether the motivation is creative or reactive, whether the goal is to build something better or merely to tear down the powerful, whether the values affirmed are genuinely life-affirming or merely inversions of what the powerful value. Ressentiment can disguise itself as justice, as compassion, as progress, while actually expressing the same old hatred of the strong by the weak. The revaluation of all values, which Nietzsche proclaimed as his philosophical mission, required overcoming ressentiment. One cannot create new values while still in the grip of reactive hatred. One cannot say yes to life while spending one's energy condemning those who seem to have more life. The revaluation required moving beyond both master and slave morality to something genuinely new. Values created not from domination, not from resentment, but from abundance, from joy, from Amor Fati. What would such values look like? Nietzsche offered hints rather than complete system. They would value strength but not domination, would affirm life including suffering, would embrace earth rather than long for heaven, would create rather than merely preserve, would risk rather than seek security. They would be aristocratic in spirit but not in social hierarchy, demanding much from oneself without demanding submission from others. They would judge by enhancement of life rather than by conformity to rule. They would say yes before they said no, would create before they destroyed. The difficulty is that we inherit 2,000 years of slave morality and resentment. Even those who reject Christianity remain shaped by Christian values. The elevation of compassion above all other virtues, the suspicion of pride and power, the belief that suffering victims are morally superior to successful achievers. These values are so deeply ingrained that we rarely question them. They seem natural, obvious, the only possible basis for ethics. To overcome them requires not just intellectual rejection, but psychological transformation, a complete reworking of how we evaluate ourselves and others. Nietzsche believed such transformation was possible, but rare. Most would remain within slave morality and ressentiment because these serve their needs, provide moral framework for their lives, make suffering bearable through moral condemnation of those who flourish. The few who could overcome ressentiment, who could create values from strength rather than weakness, who could say yes to life without requiring cosmic justification, these would be the philosophers of the future, the free spirits, the ones who might eventually become Übermenschen. Amor Fati, the love of fate, represents the culmination of Nietzsche's philosophy of affirmation. The phrase appears in The Gay Science and recurs throughout his later works as a formula for greatness, the ultimate achievement of the will, the supreme expression of yes-saying to existence. It means not merely accepting what happens, not merely enduring fate with stoic resignation, but actively loving it, wanting nothing to be different, embracing necessity with the same passion others reserve for freedom. The concept developed gradually through Nietzsche's work. In the middle period, he emphasized freedom from tradition, from metaphysics, from moral prejudice. The free spirit was defined by independence, by the ability to think without external authority. But freedom from is empty without freedom for. What does one do with freedom? How does one live when all traditional guideposts have been removed? Amor Fati provides an answer. One loves what is, including what was, including what necessarily follows from what was. This sounds paradoxical. How can one love necessity? Love seems to require choice, the possibility that things could be otherwise. But Nietzsche distinguished loving fate from choosing fate. We do not choose what happens to us, do not choose our bodies or our historical moment or the consequences of past actions. All of this is given, necessary, fated. The question is our relationship to this necessity. Do we resent it, wish it were otherwise, long for escape? Or do we love it, affirm it, make it our own through willing it? To will backward is the key. Everything that happened necessarily led to this moment, to this person we have become. If we change anything in the past, we would not be ourselves but someone else. The loss of a parent, the failure of a relationship, the rejection by others, the suffering and disappointment, all of these shaped who we are. To wish them away is to wish ourselves away. Amor Fati means willing backward, saying yes to everything that happened because it made us who we are, because we would not change who we are even to avoid what we suffered. This requires tremendous strength. It is easy to affirm the pleasant parts of life, the successes and joys and moments of connection. It is much harder to affirm the painful parts, the losses and failures and betrayals. Yet selective affirmation is not real affirmation. One cannot love only parts of one's fate, cannot accept some necessities while resenting others. The whole hangs together as a unity. Either one affirms the whole, or one has not truly achieved amor fati. Nietzsche lived this difficulty. His life included chronic illness, professional failure, romantic rejection, profound loneliness, misunderstanding by almost everyone. Could he say yes to all of it? Could he love even the suffering that made most days an ordeal? His philosophy of amor fati was not abstract theory, but existential challenge he set himself. The evidence suggests he achieved it, at least in moments. He wrote about his suffering without self-pity, described his solitude as necessary for his philosophy, claimed he would not change anything even if he could. The relationship to eternal recurrence is intimate. If you must live your life again eternally, the question is whether this thought fills you with horror or joy. Amor fati is the state where the thought fills you with joy, where you actively want your life to recur, where repetition is not curse but blessing. The person who has achieved amor fati can face eternal recurrence without despair because he loves his fate completely, wants nothing different, affirms the whole with all its suffering. This is not optimism. Nietzsche was not claiming that everything works out for the best, that suffering serves hidden purposes, that the universe is arranged for human benefit. He rejected all such comforting illusions. The world is indifferent to human hopes. Suffering serves no purpose. Many lives end in tragedy and waste. Amor fati is affirmation despite this, not because of happy endings, but despite terrible realities. It is tragic affirmation, the ability to say yes, even when fully aware of life's horror. The Greeks in Nietzsche's reading achieved something like this. They looked at existence honestly, saw its terrible aspects clearly, and through tragedy learned to affirm it anyway. The tragic hero suffers and dies, but the suffering is transformed into something beautiful through artistic representation. The audience experiences catharsis, purgation of emotions, and emerges somehow strengthened rather than crushed. Greek tragedy at its height was amor fati in aesthetic form, facing the worst while saying yes to the whole. Christian amor fati, by contrast, is counterfeit. Christianity teaches resignation to God's will, acceptance of suffering as divine plan, hope for compensation in heaven. This is not true affirmation, but conditional acceptance. I accept this suffering because God will redeem it, because it serves some higher purpose, because I will be rewarded later. Remove the otherworldly hope, and Christian resignation collapses. True amor fati requires no such props, no promises of redemption, no cosmic purposes. It loves fate purely for itself, finding the world sufficient without additions. The Stoics came closer to genuine amor fati. They taught acceptance of fate, recognition that much lies beyond our control, focus on what we can change rather than what we cannot. But Stoic acceptance still aimed at tranquility, at freedom from disturbance, at minimizing suffering through not caring too much. Nietzsche wanted something more passionate, not detachment, but attachment, not minimizing suffering, but affirming it as part of the whole, not tranquility, but joyful engagement with all of life, including its terrible aspects. How does one cultivate amor fati? Nietzsche offered no systematic method, no practices or exercises. It seems to emerge from strength, from health, from abundance, rather than lack. Those who have much life, who overflow with vitality, can afford to affirm even suffering because the suffering does not define them. Those who have little life, who are already crushed by existence, cannot love additional suffering. This creates a troubling implication. Amor fati may be available only to the strong, while the weak need the consolations of religion or philosophy that make suffering seem purposeful. Yet Nietzsche himself achieved amor fati despite terrible suffering, suggesting it is not simply a matter of fortunate circumstance. Perhaps it is a matter of interpretation of how one frames one's experience. Perhaps it is a choice, not in the sense of deliberate decision, but in the sense of fundamental orientation toward existence. Perhaps some achieve it through grace, through moments when everything suddenly makes sense and can be affirmed. Or perhaps it remains always a goal rather than achievement, something to strive toward without fully reaching. The formula for greatness, Nietzsche wrote, is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendaciousness in the face of what is necessary, but love it. This is the challenge Nietzsche set, not to bear existence grudgingly, not to hope for better, not to long for escape, but to love what is with the same passion others reserve for their ideals. Whether this is possible, whether anyone has ever fully achieved it, remains an open question. But the attempt, the striving toward this affirmation, is what Nietzsche meant by overcoming nihilism, by creating values after the death of God, by saying yes to life without requiring cosmic justification. The year 1888 brought an explosion of productivity unlike anything in Nietzsche's previous work. Living mostly in Turin, in a small rented room with a view of the Alps, Nietzsche wrote with feverish intensity. Between April and December, he completed The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and Nietzsche contra Wagner, along with substantial portions of several other projects. The works show astonishing brilliance mixed with growing grandiosity, philosophical insight combined with personal inflation. Reading them now, knowing what came next, we see a mind approaching the edge of the abyss. Twilight of the Idols, subtitled How to Philosophize with a Hammer, was written in September 1888 and published that year. The title puns on Wagner's Twilight of the Gods while announcing Nietzsche's method, not worship of idols, but their destruction. The hammer metaphor is clarified in the preface. One does not smash idols, but taps them to hear whether they ring hollow. Most of philosophy's sacred concepts, when tested, prove empty, lacking substance, mere words without referent. The book systematically tests and finds hollow most of what Western philosophy has considered most certain. The section, How the Real World Finally Became a Fable, traces in 6 brief paragraphs the entire history of Western metaphysics from Plato to Nietzsche's own philosophy. Plato invented the real world, the realm of forms, as something attainable by the wise. Christianity made it unattainable in this life, but promised in the next. Kant made it unknowable, but still morally necessary. Positivism declared it unnecessary and meaningless. Nietzsche announced that once the real world has been abolished, the apparent world goes with it. There is only this world, and calling it either real or apparent makes no sense. The whole structure of metaphysics collapses, leaving only earth, life, this existence without otherworldly doubles. The book contains some of Nietzsche's most quotable aphorisms. What does not kill me makes me stronger. I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. The will to a system is a lack of integrity. Without music, life would be a mistake. It is accessible, brilliant, and deliberately provocative, written to announce conclusions that previous works had been working toward. Twilight was supposed to be an introduction to Nietzsche's philosophy for new readers, a gateway to the more difficult works. The Antichrist, written in September but not published until after Nietzsche's collapse, was far less accessible. Subtitled Curse on Christianity, it presented Nietzsche's most sustained attack on Christian values, Christian history, and Christian morality. The opening defines good as what enhances power, bad as weakness. Happiness is growth in power. Christianity inverts this completely, making weakness, virtue, and power sin. Christianity is therefore the greatest disaster in human history, a slave revolt in morality that succeeded in imposing sick values on European civilization for 2 millennia. The attack intensifies throughout the book. Christianity is not merely false but actively harmful, not merely error but poison. It cultivates guilt, promotes self-hatred, valorizes suffering, makes people ashamed of their natural instincts. It teaches that life is preparation for death, earth is exile from heaven, the body is corrupt and only the soul matters. It takes everything healthy and makes it seem diseased, takes everything diseased and calls it healthy. The Christian priest is a parasite who lives by convincing others they are sick, and only he has the cure. Jesus himself receives mixed treatment. Nietzsche distinguishes the actual Jesus, a kind of enlightened teacher who rejected law and authority, from the Christ of Christianity invented by Paul and the Church. The real Jesus might have been admirable in his way, living a kind of eternal childhood, refusing power, embracing all. But Christianity betrayed Jesus, turned his teaching into its opposite, used his name to justify everything he opposed. Paul, the founder of Christianity as historical religion, was a genius of ressentiment, the one who figured out how to turn crucifixion into redemption, weakness into virtue, suffering into the path to salvation. Ecce Homo, written in October and November, but not published until 1908, was Nietzsche's intellectual autobiography. The title means, "Behold the Man," Pilate's words presenting Christ to the crowd, now ironically applied to Nietzsche himself. The chapter titles announce the book's tone: Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, Why I Am a Destiny. This sounds like either supreme confidence or delusions of grandeur. Reading the book suggests both. In Why I Am So Wise, Nietzsche discusses his health, his diet, his habits. He attributes his wisdom to having experienced both sickness and health, both decline and recovery, both pessimism and affirmation. He has looked into the abyss and not been swallowed. He has suffered enormously and learned to say yes anyway. This gives him perspective others lack, understanding of both ascending and descending life. He is neither German nor nationalist, but a good European. He is neither philosopher in the academic sense, nor writer in the literary sense, but something new, a psychologist of decadence, a physician of culture. Why I Am So Clever continues in this vein. Nietzsche explains his solitude as necessary for his work, his lack of readers as proof of his depth, his opposition as evidence of his importance. He discusses his inability to read scholars, his preference for brevity over system, his conviction that he is misunderstood because he is untimely. He describes his experiences with Wagner, with Lou Salomé, with his sister Elizabeth. The tone veers between genuine insight and troubling self-absorption. Why I Write Such Good Books provides brief essays on each of Nietzsche's major works, explaining what he was attempting, what he achieved, why readers have failed to understand. On The Birth of Tragedy, it discovered something essential about Greek culture that scholars had missed, the Dionysian truth beneath Apollinian form. On The Untimely Meditations, they established his opposition to German culture. On Human, All Too Human, it marked his liberation from Wagner and metaphysics. On Zarathustra, it is the deepest book in any literature, the gift of gifts, something unprecedented in human history. Why I Am a Destiny announces Nietzsche's ultimate self-understanding. He is not just a philosopher, but the philosopher who divides history into before and after. He brings the revaluation of all values, the exposure of Christianity as nihilism, the possibility of new values for the future. He is dynamite, the one who shatters idols, who asks questions no one has dared ask. He foresees terrible conflicts arising from his philosophy. Wars fought over his ideas, a century of catastrophe as the old values collapse. He takes responsibility for this, claims it as his fate, his destiny as the one who destroys so that something new can be built. Reading Ecce Homo. Knowing what came 6 weeks later, one sees warning signs. The grandiosity is extreme even for Nietzsche, who was never modest. The sense of world historical importance, while not entirely delusional, given Nietzsche's actual influence, exceeds reasonable self-assessment. The conviction that he is misunderstood by everyone, that only the future will grasp his genius, while containing truth, also suggests paranoid thinking. The book is brilliant, full of genuine insight, often very funny. But it is also disturbing, showing a mind losing its moorings even while retaining astonishing power. The works of 1888 represent both culmination and collapse. Nietzsche achieved unprecedented clarity about his philosophical project, stated his conclusions more forcefully than ever before, displayed intellectual powers at their height, but the psychological strain, the loneliness, the sense of mission without response, the grandiose self-conception, these were building toward catastrophe. He would write letters in December calling himself the first philosopher of Europe and claiming he was about to become incomparably the most famous man. On January 3rd, 1889, in Turin, the mind that had produced these remarkable works would collapse completely. The productive life was over. 11 years of silence would follow. On the morning of January 3rd, 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche left his lodgings on the Via Carlo Alberto in Turin and walked toward the Piazza Carlo Alberto, a few blocks away. It was a clear winter day. Nietzsche was 44 years old, in the midst of what seemed like unprecedented productivity and clarity. He had written Ecce Homo in October, finished revisions in November, and was planning more works. The previous evening he had sent letters to several people announcing his philosophical importance in grandiose terms. He seemed to be his usual self, alone but functioning, suffering but working. In the piazza, a coachman was beating his horse, trying to force the animal to move when it had collapsed or refused. Nietzsche saw this, and something broke. He rushed forward, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and collapsed. Witnesses reported that he was weeping, that he would not let go of the horse, that he seemed to have lost consciousness or control. His landlord, who had been watching from a window, came down and with difficulty brought Nietzsche back to his rooms. There Nietzsche either fell unconscious or into a strange state of agitation, singing, shouting, saying things that made no sense. Over the next few days, he sent letters that revealed complete mental breakdown. To Jacob Burckhardt, the distinguished historian at Basel. Dear Professor, in the end I would much rather be a Basel professor than God, but I have not dared push my private egoism so far as to desist for its sake from the creation of the world. To Cosima Wagner, Ariadne, I love you, Dionysus. To Peter Gast, various confused messages, sometimes signed Dionysus, sometimes the Crucified. The handwriting was Nietzsche's, but the content made clear that whoever wrote these letters was no longer the philosopher who had written Ecce Homo 3 months earlier. Burckhardt showed Nietzsche's letter to Franz Overbeck, who immediately travelled to Turin. Overbeck arrived on January 7th to find Nietzsche in a state of complete collapse. He was alternately catatonic and wildly agitated. He spoke nonsense, sang fragments of songs, seemed not to recognise Overbeck. He claimed to be various people: Dionysus, the Crucified, the Duke of Cumberland, Prado the murderer. When lucid enough to speak coherently, he said he wanted all anti-Semites shot, claimed to have ordered the Kaiser arrested, announced he had summoned a meeting of European sovereigns. The delusions were grandiose, messianic, occasionally violent, always divorced from reality. Overbeck secured medical consultation and arranged for Nietzsche to be transported back to Basel, where he could be properly cared for. The journey by train was difficult. Nietzsche was sometimes docile, sometimes unmanageable. He sang, shouted, made advances to other passengers. At one point he claimed the police were looking for him because he had killed several people. None of this was true. His mind had simply come untethered from reality. In Basel, he was admitted to a psychiatric clinic and remained there for several weeks under observation. The diagnosis was uncertain then and remains debated now. The doctors at the time concluded he was suffering from tertiary syphilis, the final stage of the disease that attacks the brain and causes dementia. This fit the symptoms: progressive paralysis, grandiose delusions, personality changes. It also fit what was known of Nietzsche's history. He had apparently contracted syphilis as a student, possibly from a single encounter with a prostitute, though evidence for this is unclear. If the diagnosis was correct, the mental collapse was organic brain disease, not psychological breakdown. The brilliant mind was being destroyed by bacteria. More recent scholarship questions the syphilis diagnosis. Some neurologists suggest CADASIL, a genetic disorder that causes strokes and vascular dementia. Others point to brain tumour or other organic conditions. The symptoms of Nietzsche's final year, the productivity burst, the grandiosity, the strange letters, could indicate early stages of brain disease rather than mere psychological strain. The collapse itself, sudden and complete, suggests organic cause rather than simple mental breakdown from stress. But we cannot know for certain. Medical records are incomplete, diagnosis was primitive by modern standards, and definitive evidence is lacking. What followed was worse than death. Nietzsche did not die in Turin, but entered a twilight existence that would last 11 years. After several weeks in Basel, his mother Franziska came to take him home to Naumburg. She cared for him there until her death in 1897, a devoted mother nursing a son who no longer recognized her. Nietzsche was docile, occasionally agitated, sometimes violent. He spoke little, and when he spoke it was often confused or delusional. He required constant supervision, help with basic tasks, protection from himself. Occasionally there were glimpses of the person he had been. Visitors reported moments when he seemed to recognize them, when his eyes showed intelligence, when he spoke in ways that suggested he understood what had happened to him. But these moments were brief and became rarer as time passed. Mostly he sat silently, staring at nothing, occasionally making sounds without meaning. The philosopher who had demanded we face existence honestly was now incapable of facing anything at all. The mind that had seen so clearly into human psychology was gone, leaving only biological organism continuing without awareness. After Franziska's death in 1897, Elizabeth took control. She had returned from the failed Paraguayan colony after her husband's suicide and had appointed herself guardian of her brother's legacy. She moved Nietzsche to Weimar, where she had established the Nietzsche Archive. She controlled access to him, permitted photographs showing the now famous philosopher in his demented state, used him as prop for her own self-promotion. She presented herself as the one who understood his work, who could explain his philosophy, who deserved credit for preserving his manuscripts and reputation. Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900, not quite 56 years old. The immediate cause was pneumonia after multiple strokes, but he had effectively died in Turin 11 years earlier. What survived was biological existence without consciousness, without personality, without anything recognizable as the person who had written those books. The last known words he spoke with apparent understanding came in 1898, when asked if he wanted something. Ja, meine Mutter. Yes, my mother. Then silence. The philosophy of eternal recurrence, of Amor Fati, of saying yes to life, all this fell silent in the mind that conceived it, leaving only questions about what the collapse means. Does it mean anything? Some have argued that the collapse invalidates the philosophy, that the madness was always latent in the ideas. If Nietzsche ended in delusional grandiosity, perhaps the Übermensch was always delusional. Perhaps the will to power was always inflated ego. Perhaps the whole philosophy was symptom rather than insight, but this seems unfair. The collapse was organic brain disease, not the logical outcome of his thought. Many have read Nietzsche and understood him without going mad. The ideas stand or fall on their merits, not on their author's unfortunate fate. Others suggest the collapse was punishment or justice, that Nietzsche's attack on Christianity and morality earned him this end. But this is superstition. Brain disease has no moral meaning. It strikes the virtuous and vicious indifferently. Nietzsche's collapse no more proves God's justice than any other medical catastrophe. It is simply tragedy, the terrible fact that minds can be destroyed by biology, that brilliance offers no protection against organic disease, that consciousness is fragile and can cease while the body continues. Perhaps the most we can say is that the collapse makes Nietzsche's philosophy more poignant. He taught amor fati, love of fate, yet his fate was this terrible ending. He taught eternal recurrence, yet his final years were eternal nightmare of confused consciousness. He taught that suffering can be affirmed as part of life's whole, yet his suffering ended in mindlessness that could affirm nothing. Whether he would have said yes to his fate if he had known it in advance, we cannot know. The question is unanswerable, but it haunts anyone who takes his philosophy seriously. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, Friedrich's younger sister, played a catastrophic role in her brother's posthumous reputation. During his productive life, she was often an irritant and sometimes an enemy. After his collapse, she became the gatekeeper of his legacy, controlling access to his manuscripts, shaping public understanding of his philosophy, and systematically misrepresenting his views to serve her own ideological commitments. The damage she inflicted would take decades to undo, and some of it persists to this day in popular misunderstandings of Nietzsche's thought. Elizabeth was born in 1846, 2 years after Friedrich. They were close in childhood, especially after their father's death, when the household consisted mostly of women and young Friedrich. Elizabeth worshipped her brilliant older brother, followed his interests, sought his approval. But she never understood his thinking. She was conventional, pious, nationalistic, anti-Semitic, everything Nietzsche came to despise. As he developed his philosophy, the gap between them widened. He attacked Christianity. She remained Christian. He praised Jewish intellectual achievement. She became violently anti-Semitic. He despised German nationalism. She embraced it fervently. The crisis came in 1885 when Elizabeth announced her engagement to Bernhard Förster, a prominent anti-Semitic agitator. Förster had been fired from his teaching position for anti-Semitic activities, had organized petitions demanding that Jews be excluded from German society, and represented everything Nietzsche found contemptible about German culture. Nietzsche opposed the marriage in the strongest terms, told Elizabeth she was dishonoring the family, broke off contact with Förster. But Elizabeth proceeded with the marriage, convinced that her brother was wrong and she was defending German racial purity. The couple moved to Paraguay to found Nueva Germania, a German colonial settlement intended to preserve Aryan racial purity away from European racial mixing. The project was disaster from the start. Poor planning, inadequate resources, settlers unprepared for tropical conditions, Förster's complete lack of practical skills. By 1889, the colony was failing, deeply in debt, with settlers wanting to leave. Förster committed suicide in June 1889 leaving Elizabeth with catastrophe. She remained in Paraguay for 2 more years trying to salvage something, then finally returned to Germany in 1893. She returned to find her brother famous. While Nietzsche lived in demented silence, his books were beginning to find readers. The generation coming of age in the 1890s discovered Zarathustra, found in Nietzsche's critiques of morality and culture, something that spoke to their sense that the old certainties were crumbling. Intellectuals, artists, writers began reading and discussing Nietzsche. Publishers wanted to issue his complete works. Scholars wanted access to his manuscripts and notes. Fame had finally arrived, but Nietzsche himself was beyond knowing it. Elizabeth recognized opportunity. She established the Nietzsche archive in Naumburg, then moved it to Weimar to be near the centers of German cultural life. She appointed herself chief interpreter of her brother's philosophy, granted interviews, wrote introductions, controlled access to unpublished materials. She had no philosophical training, no scholarly credentials, no genuine understanding of her brother's thought. But she had the manuscripts, and she had the legal authority as his guardian, and this gave her power over his reputation. She began systematically distorting his legacy. She suppressed evidence of his opposition to anti-Semitism, highlighted passages that could be read as supporting nationalism, edited his notebooks to emphasize will to power as domination. Most damagingly, she compiled fragments from his notes into a book called The Will to Power and presented it as Nietzsche's systematic philosophy, his final masterwork. This was complete fabrication. Nietzsche had abandoned the plan for such a book, had used many of the notes in other published works, had explicitly rejected the project. But Elizabeth constructed a book from his fragments, organized them according to her own understanding, and presented this editorial construction as his intended magnum opus. The Will to Power, as published by Elizabeth, emphasized precisely what Nietzsche had opposed: power as domination, strength as violence, the Übermensch as conqueror. It read like philosophy for fascists, celebration of force over weakness, justification for the powerful to rule the powerless. This matched Elizabeth's own ideology perfectly, but completely misrepresented her brother's actual philosophy. Nietzsche had been careful to distinguish will to power from political domination, to present the Übermensch as cultural and spiritual ideal rather than racial superiority, to ground his philosophy in self-overcoming rather than conquest of others. Elizabeth's version erased these distinctions. She welcomed Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche in the 1930s. Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive, was photographed with the bust of the philosopher, praised Nietzsche as philosophical inspiration for National Socialism. Elizabeth, by then in her 80s, was delighted. She saw in Nazism the realization of what she believed her brother had prophesied: the triumph of German strength, the purification of racial stock, the overcoming of weak democratic and Christian values. That Nietzsche would have been horrified by all of this, that he had explicitly and repeatedly denounced nationalism and anti-Semitism, that his philosophy contradicted Nazi ideology at every point. None of this mattered to Elizabeth. She had created her own Nietzsche, and the Nazis enthusiastically embraced her version. The damage was enormous and long-lasting. For much of the 20th century, many people knew Nietzsche only through Nazi appropriation, as the philosopher who inspired fascism, who taught that might makes right, who advocated for racial supremacy and contempt for the weak. This reputation made serious engagement with his work difficult. Philosophers who might have learned from him avoided him as tainted. Political movements that might have found resources in his thought kept their distance. The association with Nazism became so strong that even decades after World War II, mentioning Nietzsche positively could mark one as suspicious. The post-war recovery of Nietzsche's actual philosophy was slow and difficult work. Scholars had to go back to Nietzsche's own writings, distinguish what he actually said from what Elizabeth and the Nazis attributed to him, demonstrate the systematic distortions in standard interpretations. Walter Kaufmann's 1950 book Nietzsche, philosopher, psychologist, Antichrist, was crucial in this rehabilitation for English-speaking audiences. Kaufmann showed that Nietzsche opposed nationalism, opposed anti-Semitism, opposed German nationalism specifically, valued Jewish intellectual achievement, and that his philosophy was incompatible with fascist ideology. Similar scholarly work happened in Germany and France. The new editions of Nietzsche's works carefully separated his published writings from editorial constructions. The Colli Montanari critical edition, begun in the 1960s, provided reliable texts free from Elizabeth's distortions. Scholars demonstrated that The Will to Power was not Nietzsche's book, but Elizabeth's compilation, that many of its most problematic passages were taken out of context or given emphasis Nietzsche never intended. The real Nietzsche slowly emerged from beneath layers of misrepresentation. But popular understanding often lags behind scholarly correction. Many people still associate Nietzsche with Nazism, still think the Übermensch means racial superiority, still believe his philosophy celebrates cruelty and domination. Elizabeth's distortions persist in popular culture even after being thoroughly refuted in academic contexts. This makes reading Nietzsche today both essential and challenging. Essential because his actual philosophy offers profound insights. Challenging because one must constantly fight against inherited misunderstandings. Elizabeth died in 1935, unrepentant, convinced she had served her brother's genius. She never understood that she had betrayed him, that she had used his name to promote everything he opposed, that future scholars would count her among the worst disasters to befall his reputation. The irony is bitter. The sister who claimed to love and honour her brother did more damage to his legacy than any critic or opponent. Nietzsche spent his life fighting against precisely the kinds of values Elizabeth embraced, yet she became the voice explaining his philosophy to the world. It would take generations to undo her work, and the task remains incomplete. The Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche ranks among the most consequential philosophical misreadings in history. From the late 1920s through 1945, Nazi ideologues claimed Nietzsche as their philosophical inspiration, presented him as the prophet of German racial supremacy and totalitarian power, and used his concepts, especially the Übermensch and will to power, to justify policies of conquest, dictatorship, and genocide. This appropriation was enabled by Elizabeth's distortions, but went far beyond anything she specifically intended. It has permanently marked Nietzsche's reputation, making necessary a clear accounting of what Nietzsche actually wrote and how it contradicts Nazi ideology at every significant point. The Nazis were drawn to several apparent features of Nietzsche's philosophy. He attacked democracy as herd mediocrity. He criticized Christianity as slave morality. He praised strength, power, and aristocratic values. He wrote about the Übermensch as humanity's future. He discussed will to power as fundamental to life. He rejected egalitarianism and humanitarian sentimentality. All of this sounded to Nazi ears like philosophical justification for their program. Dictatorship over democracy, German paganism over Christianity, racial aristocracy over egalitarian weakness, conquest as expression of will to power. But this reading required ignoring, distorting, or suppressing almost everything else Nietzsche wrote. Consider nationalism. Nietzsche was consistently, explicitly, vehemently opposed to nationalism in general and German nationalism in particular. He called himself a good European rather than a German. He said German culture was provincial and declining. He left Germany and refused to return. He wrote that nationalistic movements were symptoms of cultural sickness, herd thinking at its most dangerous. He praised European cultural mixing and warned against racial or national purification. None of this stopped Nazis from claiming him as German nationalist philosopher. Consider anti-Semitism. Nietzsche opposed anti-Semitism explicitly and repeatedly throughout his writings. He broke with Wagner primarily over Wagner's anti-Semitism. He refused contact with his sister after she married an anti-Semite. He praised Jewish intellectual achievement and suggested that European culture had benefited from Jewish influence. He described anti-Semites as vulgar, resentment-driven masses, as failures blaming others for their inadequacy, as the kind of herd mentality his philosophy opposed. He wrote to his sister that he wanted all anti-Semites shot, clearly hyperbole, but indicating the intensity of his opposition. The Nazis simply ignored all of this. Consider the Übermensch. Nietzsche never described the Übermensch in racial terms, never suggested it meant biological superiority, never connected it to German or Aryan identity. The Übermensch was spiritual and cultural, not genetic. It referred to individuals who could create values and affirm life, not to racial groups who could dominate others. Nietzsche explicitly rejected racial thinking as pseudo-scientific prejudice. The Nazi transformation of Übermensch into Aryan Superman was complete distortion, reading into Nietzsche's concept what was never there and contradicted everything Nietzsche actually wrote about race and nationalism. Consider will to power. Nietzsche did not mean political power, military conquest, or domination of others. Will to power referred to life's fundamental character as self-overcoming, growth, creativity. It was psychological and metaphysical, not political. Every living thing expresses will to power by striving to grow and overcome resistance. But this does not justify conquest or oppression. The artist expresses will to power through creating art, the philosopher through thinking new thoughts, any person through becoming who they are capable of becoming. The Nazi reading of will to power as justification for invasion and domination was precisely the kind of crude misreading Nietzsche warned against. Consider his critique of morality. Nietzsche attacked slave morality and Christian values, but he was not promoting cruelty or celebrating suffering. He wanted life-affirming values to replace life-denying ones, but life affirmation does not mean making others suffer. His critique was of systematic pity and guilt, not of all compassion. He himself was moved to tears by suffering and broke down over a beaten horse. His philosophy aimed at human flourishing and excellence, not at justifying violence. The Nazi celebration of cruelty and brutality contradicted everything Nietzsche meant by overcoming and greatness. How then did the appropriation happen? Partly through Elizabeth's editorial work, which presented Nietzsche in ways compatible with fascism. Partly through selective quotation, taking passages out of context to support positions Nietzsche opposed. Partly through willful misreading, seeing what one wanted to see rather than what the text actually said. Partly through historical circumstance. Germany after World War I was hungry for philosophical justification of revival and revenge, and Nietzsche's rhetoric of strength and overcoming could be twisted to serve this hunger. But deeper factors were at work. Nietzsche's writing style, with its aphorisms and metaphors and deliberate provocations, made it easy to quote him selectively. His attack on morality could seem to justify immoralism if one ignored his careful distinctions. His praise of strength could seem to celebrate violence if one missed his emphasis on self-mastery rather than domination. His aristocratic values could seem to support political hierarchy if one ignored his criticism of actual aristocracies and his individualist rather than collectivist emphasis. The Nazis exploited these ambiguities ruthlessly. After World War II, philosophers faced the task of rescuing Nietzsche from Nazi appropriation. This required showing systematically how Nazi ideology contradicted Nietzsche's actual positions, how the appropriation depended on distortion, how a careful reading revealed a philosopher fundamentally opposed to everything Nazism represented. Walter Kaufmann led this effort in English-speaking world, publishing translations with extensive commentaries explaining context and refuting misreadings. Similar work occurred in German and French academic philosophy, recovering the actual Nietzsche beneath layers of appropriation. The rehabilitation was largely successful in academic contexts. Contemporary Nietzsche scholars understand that he opposed nationalism, opposed anti-Semitism, did not advocate political domination, cannot be read as proto-fascist without gross distortion. But popular understanding has been slower to change. Many people still associate Nietzsche with Nazism, still believe he inspired fascism, still approach his work with suspicion rooted in this historical appropriation. This makes reading Nietzsche today both more necessary and more difficult. Necessary because his actual philosophy offers important insights, difficult because one must constantly distinguish what he actually wrote from what he has been claimed to have written. The lesson extends beyond Nietzsche. Any philosophical work can be misread and misused. Any powerful ideas can be distorted to serve purposes opposed to their original intent. The question is not whether a philosophy can be appropriated by those who misunderstand it. Any philosophy can, but whether the philosophy itself, properly understood, supports or contradicts the appropriation. In Nietzsche's case, proper understanding reveals systematic contradiction between his actual philosophy and Nazi ideology. The appropriation was not interpretation but distortion, not faithful reading, but willful misreading in service of political ends. Reading Nietzsche now requires historical awareness of this appropriation and its refutation. One cannot simply ignore the Nazi connection as if it never happened, but neither should one accept it as revealing Nietzsche's true intentions. The task is to read carefully, attend to context, follow arguments rather than cherry-pick quotations, and distinguish the philosopher from those who claimed him for purposes he would have despised. This is demanding work, but it is necessary if we are to learn from one of the most important and most misunderstood philosophers of the modern age. Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900. His productive life ended in 1889. His major works were written between 1872 and 1888. Yet his influence on 20th and 21st century thought has been profound and continuous. He matters not as historical curiosity, but as living presence in contemporary philosophy, psychology, politics, art, and culture. Understanding why requires seeing how his central insights address problems that remain ours, how his questions are still our questions, how the crisis he diagnosed continues to define our situation. The death of God is not merely 19th century atheism, but ongoing cultural condition. Nietzsche saw that the loss of religious belief would eventually undermine all values grounded in religious worldview. Objective morality, cosmic purpose, inherent meaning, transcendent truth. We still live with these consequences. Contemporary debates about whether morality can survive without religious foundation, whether life has meaning in a purely material universe, whether truth exists or everything is relative, these are the debates Nietzsche predicted. He saw the problem coming and tried to think through what might come after. The diagnosis of nihilism remains urgent. Nihilism for Nietzsche was not merely disbelief, but the devaluation of all values, the sense that nothing matters, that existence lacks purpose or significance. Contemporary culture shows symptoms of precisely this: ironic distance from all commitments, consumer culture offering pleasures but not meaning, political cynicism treating all values as masks for power, cultural exhaustion, unable to create new art or ideas but only endlessly recycling the past. Whether we call this nihilism or postmodernity or late capitalism, the phenomenon is what Nietzsche described: the inability to believe in anything deeply after traditional sources of meaning have collapsed. The concept of ressentiment illuminates contemporary politics and culture. Nietzsche identified how the powerless gain power through moral condemnation, how victimhood can become identity, how resentment masquerades as righteousness. This insight applies across political spectrum. Religious conservatives condemning secular culture from position of cultural weakness. Social justice movements defining themselves primarily through opposition to oppression, populist movements channeling economic frustration into hatred of elites. Not all criticism is ressentiment, but Nietzsche's concept helps distinguish life-affirming critique from reactive hatred. The genealogical method became foundational for 20th century thought. Instead of asking whether values are true, ask where they come from and what purposes they serve. Instead of taking moral beliefs at face value, examine their historical origins and psychological motivations. Foucault's histories of sexuality and madness, feminist interrogation of gender norms, post-colonial critique of Western universalism, all employ genealogical method pioneered by Nietzsche. The move from justification to explanation, from norm to history, from essence to construction defines much contemporary critical thought. Nietzsche's psychology anticipated and influenced psychoanalysis. His emphasis on unconscious drives, his recognition that we do not transparently understand our own motivations, his analysis of guilt and self-punishment, his investigation of how conscience develops, all this prefigured Freud. Freud acknowledged the debt while claiming he avoided reading Nietzsche to preserve his own originality. Whether or not Freud directly borrowed, Nietzsche established the depth psychological approach that treats consciousness as surface phenomenon, concealing deeper forces. Existentialism drew heavily on Nietzsche's questions: how to live after the death of God, how to create meaning in meaningless universe, how to face death without religious consolation, how to choose values without ultimate foundations. These became central concerns for Jaspers, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus. The existentialist emphasis on authenticity, individual responsibility, and creating meaning through commitment owes much to Nietzsche's insistence that we must create values rather than discover them, that we are responsible for giving meaning to our lives without relying on cosmic purposes. Continental philosophy's anti-foundationalism follows Nietzsche's rejection of absolute grounds. His perspectivism, the view that all knowing occurs from particular perspectives rather than from nowhere, anticipated contemporary recognition that objectivity is problematic, that all claims reflect particular situated viewpoints. His attack on metaphysical oppositions prefigured Derrida's deconstruction. His emphasis on power in knowledge anticipated Foucault's power-knowledge analyses. Much 20th century French philosophy is sustained engagement with Nietzsche's provocations. In ethics, Nietzsche's critique of morality opened new possibilities. Contemporary virtue ethics, with its emphasis on character and flourishing rather than rules and duties, owes debt to Nietzsche's question about what kinds of human beings and lives we should value. His challenge to universal moral rules anticipates particularist ethics that attend to context. His emphasis on power and creativity influenced ethical naturalism that grounds values in facts about human nature and needs. Even those who reject his specific claims must engage his fundamental question: where do values come from once we stop believing they come from God? In aesthetics, Nietzsche's emphasis on art's importance for life, his analysis of tragedy, his concept of Dionysian creativity influenced modernism and postmodernism. His suggestion that life itself might be treated as aesthetic creation, that one could become artist of one's own life, resonates through 20th century culture. The idea that meaning comes through creation rather than discovery, that beauty justifies existence, that art matters more than conventional morality, these Nietzschean themes permeate contemporary aesthetics. For political philosophy, Nietzsche poses uncomfortable challenges. His attack on democracy and equality cannot be simply embraced, but neither should it be dismissed. He forces us to ask whether egalitarianism might level down rather than lift up, whether mass movements sacrifice individual excellence, whether liberal values produce mediocrity. Contemporary debates about elite expertise versus popular wisdom, about whether democracies make bad decisions, about trade-offs between equality and excellence, all echo Nietzschean concerns. We need not accept his conclusions to benefit from his questions. In cultural criticism, Nietzsche established the tradition of diagnosing cultural sickness and decline. His analysis of how cultures lose vitality, become decadent, substitute reaction for creation applies beyond his specific targets. The question of whether Western culture is declining, whether we have lost capacity for greatness, whether we are becoming last men seeking only comfort, these remain live debates. Contemporary anxieties about social media superficiality, consumer culture hollowness, political discourse degradation, all recall Nietzschean worries about cultural decline. Most fundamentally, Nietzsche matters because his central question remains unanswered. How do we live well after traditional foundations have collapsed? How do we create meaning in a universe that does not provide it? How do we say yes to life that includes suffering and ends in death? How do we distinguish noble from base without appealing to God or nature or reason as ultimate authorities? These questions define modern condition, and we have not yet found fully satisfying answers. Nietzsche did not provide final answers either, but he formulated the questions with unprecedented clarity and force. Reading Nietzsche today requires critical engagement. We should reject his misogyny, question his aristocratic radicalism, be wary of his rhetoric of strength and power. We should recognize historical limitations, acknowledge valid criticisms, avoid cult of personality. But we should also take seriously his diagnosis of nihilism, his genealogical method, his demand for intellectual honesty, his challenge to create values rather than merely receive them. We can learn from Nietzsche without becoming Nietzscheans, can benefit from his insights without accepting all his conclusions. The ultimate reason Nietzsche still matters is that he asked the right questions at the right time. The death of God is not event in the past, but ongoing situation. The crisis of values is not historical curiosity, but contemporary predicament. The need to create meaning without foundations is not 19th century problem, but our problem. Nietzsche saw this coming, tried to think it through, offered some possibilities while warning of dangers. We are still living in the world he diagnosed, still working through the implications of the death of God, still learning what it means to stand alone without ultimate grounds. Until we have fully answered his questions, if we ever do, Nietzsche will remain essential, challenging, impossibly difficult, and absolutely necessary.